Welcome everyone. This is the Thursday, May 31st, 2012 Planning and Zoning meeting. Mr. Tripton, will you please lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic which stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
The second item on our agenda this evening is the approval of the minutes from April 26, 2012. Do I have a motion?
Make a motion to approve.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes. Item number 3 is something that is not on consent. It is a request for an administrative permit use for an approval of a facility to be known as Fire Station 13. You guys want to take it away?
Yes, thank you, Chairman Zimmerman.
Do we need to swear them in first? Would you go ahead and lead them in swearing them in, please?
I don't need to do it. Anybody that's going to testify to this matter, if they would stand and raise their right hand, please. Solemnly, I'm sorry. Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chairman Zimmerman. John McCoy with the planning staff. This is an administrative permit use for Fire Station 13. Administrative permit uses are uses that are allowed in zoning districts with certain conditions, and I want to briefly describe the scope of the application. This facility was previously owned by the Department of Forestry, and it was a forestry facility. It's since been purchased by Emergency Services, and they're looking at converting it to a fire station and also a maintenance facility for emergency vehicles. And essentially 2 phases, and I'll go over that in a little more detail, but the first phase will be the maintenance phase, the second phase will be the fire station phase, and sort of the big picture. And there's a not included parcel I'll also talk about. The location of the proposed fire station maintenance facility is at the northwest corner of 43rd Avenue and 4th Street. And the area is predominantly residential in nature, and it's residentially zoned. While being residential in nature, the property immediately to the north is a church. It's St. Augustine of Canterbury, and across 4th Street to the south is Temple Beth Shalom. So those are 2 institutional uses that are close by. Immediately to the west is a residential subdivision, and across 43rd Avenue to the east is another residential subdivision. This is the site plan, and there are 3 buildings. The orange building's an existing building that showed on the aerial. That was what the Forestry Service used as their maintenance facility, and it will continue to be used by the Emergency Services Department for maintaining their vehicles. They'll also be building the building just to the west of that for maintenance for some of their larger vehicles. And then the fire station is the building in the center of the parcel. As far as the phasing plan goes, the green area covering the first 2 buildings is the first phase, along with the driveway, the western driveway, and then the area in yellow with the fire station, the remainder of the internal circulation, and the larger stormwater pond is the second phase. The area in white is an area that's lessed out and not included area. It's still part of the same ownership, but it'll be leased to the Historic Society, and that is the location of the fire tower itself. If you're familiar with the site, there's still the tower there today. It doesn't really show on these plans real well, but it's right about where the L in lease is from a physical location standpoint. As far as traffic, it's a fairly straightforward traffic circulation plan. During phase 1, it'll be a 2-way driveway at the western side of the site. They'll use that for both entering and exiting the site. And then with phase 2, the eastern driveway will be constructed. That will be an ingress only, and that'll be for the larger vehicles. That parking area you see in front will be 2-way, but it'll be marked "Do not enter" once you get to the eastern terminus of that driveway. So you'd need to go back to the west. The other thing I'd like to point out there is a sidewalk along the 4th Street frontage That'll be constructed with Phase 2 of the project, the fire station facility. As far as stormwater goes, again, it's phased. The western retention area is the Phase 1. The eastern retention area, the wet one, is Phase 2. The western one's dry, the eastern one's wet, is Phase 2. And the Phase 2 retention area will also serve for retention and stormwater treatment for some of the 43rd Avenue improvements. So it's tied in with another project as well, a dual use. As far as the landscape plan, the items I've highlighted are the buffers. And the fire station requires a type C buffer. In this case, they've exceeded those requirements on the west perimeter where they are adjacent to residential and provided a type B buffer. In addition, if you look at the existing conditions, the proposed building is much further away than the existing pavement and some of the existing activities on that site in the past. So there will be about a 60-foot setback buffer and stormwater. So that gets pulled a little bit further away to the east. It provides a greater separation, and they have exceeded the buffer. Along the north, adjacent to the church, they're proposing the type C buffer, which meets the code requirement. A couple other items I'd just like to touch on. They will be removing some specimen hardwood trees. They have requested to pay a fee in lieu of mitigation instead of going out and planting trees. There's a formula in the code for that. That's been approved by environmental planning. They will need to pay that prior to a land clearing permit, so prior to the impact. They will need to construct the buffers with the respective phases, and they'll need to construct the sidewalk along 4th Street with prior to the CO for Phase 2. And with that, I'd like to get to the recommendation, and staff does recommend that the Planning and Zoning Commission grant administrative permit use for the fire station with the conditions in the staff report. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your report. I know that there were several of you in the audience that perhaps wanted to speak. We have a very, very busy night tonight, so I don't want to discourage anyone, but this seems like a relatively straightforward thing, so unless you're going to stand up and speak maybe strongly against it or something like that, maybe we can just kind of move on. I really don't want to discourage anyone, but is there anyone from the audience this evening that wants to speak on this matter?
Do you have to ask about ex parte communication?
Yes, I did miss one thing, Mr. DeBrawl. I must ask all of the commissioners if you have had any ex parte communications about any of the items on our agenda this evening that you must disclose that would prevent you from giving a fair and reasonable verdict on them. Please disclose that now. Is there anyone who has had that?
I haven't had ex parte communications, but I do have a disclosure to make for the record on the next item.
Okay, well, we'll bring that up when the time comes. Anyone else?
Nope.
Okay, we can move on. Anybody from the audience that wants to speak to the item currently on the agenda? No. Anyone up here have anything to say about it?
Move approval as presented.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Passes. Item number 4 is a public hearing. It's a quasi-judicial matter. It is a request for special exception use and approval for a community center for the Pelican Island Audubon Society. And again, if anyone wishes to speak on this matter, you need to be sworn in now, so Mr. DeBrawl will take over for that.
If anyone that wants to give testimony on this matter could please rise and raise their right hand. Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Thank you very much.
You want me to do my disclosure?
Yes, let's hear your disclosure.
For the public record, I was on the board and an officer of Pelican Island Audubon Society for 24 years. I have not been such since early 2010. I am merely a member at this point, and after talking with Attorney Polakowicz, because I have no vested interest, I'm kind of bound by the legislator to take part in the vote. Thank you.
And I am a neighbor. I work at the University of Florida lab, and so I do a site visit probably 4 times a day by just being there. But I have no vested interest.
Okay, guys, take it away.
All right. Thank you, Chairman Zimmerman. John McCoy with the planning staff. This is a special exception use request for a community center from the Pelican Island Audubon Society. As far as special exception uses, I'd like just to touch on the process. And they do need to meet the specific land use criteria. There's an appropriate and compatibility review. There are 2 public hearings. This is the first of those public hearings. The second is before the Board of County Commissioners. The Planning and Zoning Commission is supposed to consider all of the relevant information and then make a recommendation to the Board of County Commission. Board of County Commission is to consider it, approve it, the request, approve it with conditions, or deny the request. The next item I'd like to get to is the actual physical location of the site. And the site is located on the east side of US 1, about close to 1,000 feet, on the south side of Oslo Road. So south side of Oslo Road, just a little ways east of US 1. And it is next to the entomology lab of those of you who are familiar with that location on Oslo Road. The site is zoned RM6, and there is a variety of zonings in the area. Mostly RM6 residential multifamily 6 units per acre and conservation. That Con 1 is conservation. And the conservation lands typically signify publicly owned lands. As you move closer to US 1, you see the general commercial CG designation on the north east corner of US 1, and Oslo Road is a shopping center, and then the conservation begins just to the east of that. This is an area with the project location. Again, you can see the shopping center at the corner, the conservation land immediately behind that. You can see some conservation area on the south side as well that's in public ownership. And then the land owned by the University of Florida, which is zoned RM6. And you can see the footprint of this proposed building. It's a fairly small footprint and a small facility, and they were attempting to keep a relatively small footprint and a small impact on the area. Well, that gets me to the site plan, and they're again trying to minimize the footprint, so they've tried to angle it in there. You can see the building is in green, and the parking lot's a 9-space parking lot. It's relatively small, and just let me toggle back to the other picture and make one other point. The area just north and slightly west of the facility is the Orca parking lot, which is county-owned, unstabilized parking that is open to the public. The facility itself is a small facility. There are 2 buildings connected by a breezeway, and that's what you're looking at in a plan view on this particular slide. Next is traffic circulation. Again, it's very straightforward. It's a single driveway, 2-way driveway. Very straightforward parking layout, double loaded as you get towards the end, and traffic engineering has improved the internal circulation plan, approved the driveway location, and approved the fact that there are no off-site traffic-related improvements required for this facility. As far as stormwater, the stormwater area is a dry stormwater. I've colored it blue just so you can identify it. It is on the east side of the site, and it's essentially a depressional area that's kind of bermed up around it. Once the stormwater is treated, it'll be discharged to the Oslo Road right-of-way. My next slide relates to buffering. Since the adjacent property is zoned residential, there's a type B buffer required, and the landscape architect's done a nice job of placing the buffering material on either side of the stormwater facility between the actual hard improvements and the adjacent property to the east. A couple related items I'd like to talk about. One is the sidewalk that is required along Oslo Road. That needs to be constructed or bonded out prior to a certificate of occupancy for the structure. The other is a tree mitigation plan. This facility will also require the removal of some specimen hardwood trees. Right now, they're proposing to mitigate in 2 different ways. One is to mitigate by planting mitigation trees on site, which they've depicted. The other is to mitigate off-site on the surrounding conservation areas, and they haven't really identified the location of those trees yet. We're going to need that plan and those locations identified prior to them getting a land clearing and tree removal permit, and then the trees will physically need to be planted prior to them receiving a certificate of occupancy for the structure. With that, I'd like to get to the recommendation, I'd like to just touch on the special exception general criteria. It needs to be found to be consistent with the comprehensive plan and the land development regulations. It needs to be shown that it's compatible with the surrounding uses as far as the character of the area. And it needs to be demonstrated that there are no adverse impacts on health, safety, and welfare. And the board has the ability to add any conditions to the application. With that, I'll get to the recommendation. And staff recommends that the Planning and Zoning Commission recommend the board grant special exception approval with the conditions in the staff report. Those deal with the tree mitigation as I described, construction of the type B buffer, construction of the sidewalk or bonding out the sidewalk and planting the mitigation trees. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. Is there anyone from the audience who would like to speak on this? And I would say the same thing probably that I said last time. If you have strong feelings against it, that would be certainly worth our time. But if not, it seems like a fairly straightforward thing. We're going to discuss it up here perhaps, but and you could always get up later, but anybody? How about anybody up here? Does anybody want to?
Can I ask a few questions
Please
for
do.
a second?
Please do.
John, is that parking stabilized or paved?
It's paved parking.
Okay. And the sidewalk is required because, I mean, it's just where it is with conservation on either side. I mean, it looks like to me you're going to get a sidewalk to nowhere.
Correct, and they have the ability to bond that out or construct it. There was a sidewalk waiver constructed with this. Public Works evaluated that and thought that, yes, there may be the necessity for a sidewalk. And I think the proximity to the commercial may have weighed in and future plans as far as extending it probably more to the west than to the east.
All right, if we were to extend it, can we extend it through the conservation area? Are you going to be able to extend that sidewalk through the conservation
Well,
area,
again,
or is it truly going to be there for nowhere, for no reason?
The sidewalk is in the right-of-way, and let me go back to a little bit bigger picture. As you look at the site's location, there's residential property essentially one parcel away, and I think in evaluating the proposed waiver, the staff looked at the sidewalk within the right-of-way and this not being a great span as far as the connection, and then the facility would be linked with the commercial area to the west.
George, I'll tell you one reason why it really might be a good thing. There's only 7 parking spaces for this public facility, but there's public parking a little down the road.
Right.
And I can imagine them having functions where, 2 or 3 staff and more than 4
Well, it'd be a good
people.
I think it'd be a good question to ask them individually. Maybe they can clarify. The reason being is this is a very small facility, and funding being what it is, the Audubon Society being who they are next to conservation land, and having to mitigate trees. I didn't know. I was even curious if we had let them encroach on our conservation property, if they could avoid some of the mitigation, if we could construct this differently, and it certainly would not hurt the county's plan in general if they even looked at that, because I think that stabilized parking for 7 parking places, it saves them some money. I'm just kind of wondering why we're forcing it, but I'm open to suggestions or discussion.
I don't know what discussions have occurred as far as the use of any county property, but again, from the sidewalk waiver standpoint, Public Works did evaluate it and thought it was worthwhile potential connection to the west.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, Roland, if they would try and use some of the conservation area for parking, are there deed restrictions that they might run into as far as that property is concerned? I mean, was that bought with state money that has strings attached to it, if you know?
Roland DuBois, Chief of Environmental Planning with the county. Are you talking about on the existing parking for Orker on the north side or to the south?
No, well, Mr. Hammond,
The idea, Roland, is we've been emphasizing that people not move any really of the hardwood trees if they didn't have to, if we could reconfigure a site plan. We have a piece of property here, and I'm not the engineer, so I don't know if it could be reconfigured where they didn't have to move so many trees or didn't have to do that. If, for instance, the parking ended up on our conservation land, or if something else happened, since it's who they are.
Well, Audubon did a really good job as far as they could, with inevitably having to remove something to develop the property.
Right.
There were inevitably a couple of oaks that had to come out. They've done a real good job micrositing it from that standpoint. To the west, which is part of the conservation area, that's more of the natural hammock area. The southern portion is the restoration.
I'm sure they didn't look at it, but you think it'd be even worse.
Yeah, there's stuff on
Okay.
the west that's just as
I don't have a problem with the
sensitive.
plan, I just was asking about trying to let them,
Yeah, this
give them
has
some
a-
relief in some areas.
This overall project evolved where at first it was looking at some use of the county property. It eventually evolved away from that, where the Audubon would actually own the property for various reasons. And in the end, from a staff standpoint, we think it evolved in a good micro-sited project.
Okay.
John, is the number of required parking spaces formula-driven based on the size of the building, or how is that number determined?
That's correct. It is formula-driven based on 1 space per 300 square feet of the building area, the enclosed building area.
Mr. Chairman, would they be allowed to operate a gift shop in here? I don't think the code
Yep.
speaks
As
to
long
it.
as it was accessory to the overall.
We heard you.
But, Bob, you can't speak tonight?
If it's accessory, yes, they can.
Thank you, Bob.
You're not live.
IT.
Anybody else have any other comments? Do I have a motion?
I have a couple other questions, and they might be geared more toward the future as far as Pelican Island. When we accepted donation of the property from the Vero Beach J.C.'s, they had, or we, had to try and research whether they had specific bylaws for their property after they dissolved. If Pelican Island would dissolve, are there any procedures that would be followed that for future recipients of the land? Does it have to be given back to National Audubon? Is it supposed to be sold and the proceeds divided? Any issues like that that anybody could address at this point?
Does it have a perpetuation plan?
Yes, and that would be my follow-up question. If Pelican Island should go away like the J.C.'s did, I think in earlier conversations with Stan that you could use this building as a single-family residence or a duplex or something along those lines, but I didn't know if Pelican Island had any such provisions at all.
I'm Richard Baker, president of the Pelican Island Audubon Society. If Pelican Island Audubon Society goes away, we'll give the property to the county, probably. I just don't see any problem with it. I just don't see us ever going away. We just celebrated our 46th time here. I just don't see it. Our membership's increasing. We're over 1,000 now. I hadn't thought about that, but we could put it in our bylaws.
Yeah.
Okay. And I don't know, maybe, Dr. May, you could address the issue as far as, is there any permission needed from the property owner? I mean, when we went to go ahead and use state lands, we had to go before the Board of Trustees, the governor's cabinet. Is there such a procedure as far as university-owned property?
I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know. Walter, you?
Please state your name and address.
Walter Tabachnik, I'm the director of the University of Florida Medical Entomology Laboratory. The land was previously owned and sold to the Audubon Society. It was previously owned by the University of Florida Foundation. So that is a sale from the University of Florida Foundation.
It
to
was
the
a free and it was a free and
Oh,
clear
yes.
sale. Then
Oh,
if
yes.
they can do it to the county, that would clean it up.
Very good,
And
thank
that's done? That's a done deal?
you. Yes, that's done.
No,
Well, that's
contingent on this approval.
approval. Excuse me, that is contingent on the approval of the building.
Okay. Thank you.
Congratulations on 42 years. Does anybody else have any other comments?
We have somebody from the audience.
Do I have, is there anybody from the audience? Yep, please come up and state your name and address for the record, please.
My name is Charlie Searcy, 1035 22nd Avenue, Vero Beach. And I do have a couple of comments. One of the things I think you gentlemen have been talking about tonight, the number of parking spaces, the brochure that I got on it said there's 9 parking spaces instead of 7. I don't know if that makes a difference, but
It's 9.
the county has spent an awful lot of money taking care of environmentally sensitive land. This land is very sensitive. It is surrounded by conservation lands, as Mr. Hamner, I think, pointed out. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me to allow construction of any kind of facility on this particular property because it is in that conservation land. If the land had not been owned by the University of Florida trustees, the zoning on the land probably would not be, and these are ifs and probablys, would not be the zoning that it has on the property now, which allows for construction. Over the years, I've had the opportunity to, I guess, be excited about the environment, not as excited as some of these folks here tonight might be. There are a couple of different things. You've got a active environmentalist, which I would consider myself to be one. We like to protect the environment and make it better when we leave the fishing grounds or the hunting grounds or whatever. But then there are the environmental activists. And in this area, it almost seems as though their goal is to stop anything that doesn't fit their agenda. This group has been operating out of the University of Florida facilities for I don't know how long. I just know they use the address of the University of Florida's environmental lab down, or the entomology lab, I'm sorry, as their headquarters. And they're going to be spending a lot of money for the land. That's their deal. They're going to spend a lot of money for the building. That's their deal. But if the University of Florida, which is a publicly owned university, and I'm a Gator and I'm proud of them, by the way, if they allow them to use that public facility, why in the world would this zoning group give a special exception to build on environmentally sensitive land? And it is environmentally sensitive, upland hammock, just to appease the group. And that's almost what it sounds to me like we're doing. If a developer were coming in here today to this meeting and asking for you to allow them to build on this site, this is probably a small crowd compared to what you would have. You would have a lot of people from this same group opposing it. And I, for one, think that that's wrong. It just doesn't make sense to allow construction on that particular piece of property. If you notice in the little handout they gave you, it is surrounded by conservation land. And so we're doing away with what this community and this county has spent millions of dollars doing, and that is buying and preserving conservation land. We're going to destroy.
This is not conservation land. This is zoned RM6. It is not. I just want to be, for the record, I want to be clear because you keep referring to it, and we have to take account of the fact that what the zoning is and what rights that gives to the property owners to do that. So I want to caution you not to keep calling it conservation land because that would be a misstatement.
but Mr. Vice Chairman, or Chairman tonight, I guess, that is the case. You're exactly right. I don't doubt that, because the maps that they gave us actually shows that's the zoning. However, the zoning was given to the University of Florida because it was all included in that piece of property they have there for the entomology lab. And so when they break this out, the zoning stayed with it. I don't know how they do that. I don't know why they did that. But it's environmentally sensitive land. I mean, I've been through some other projects in the same area, and it just seems as though everything that you try to do in making improvements, you get shot down, which is maybe what I'm trying to do tonight. But it also makes a lot of sense to improve existing facilities as opposed to creating new facilities and covering this 1 acre of property up with buildings. And I would encourage you to not approve, make a special exception for this particular building. I think it's wrong, and you guys get to make that decision, but I would certainly encourage you to not change the zoning, but make a special exception in the zoning.
The way I understand it, I'll be corrected by our attorney here or anybody else, what I read is that with a special exception use approval, that the zoning is residential multifamily up to 6 units per acre. I don't know how that happened, but that's the facts that we're presented with. And what we are tasked with deciding tonight, for the record, is the Planning and Zoning Commission is to consider the appropriateness of the requested use for the subject site and compatibility of the use with the surrounding area. And my understanding of what this use is that it's a, you know, it's a place where people can come and learn about the environment. That's my general understanding of what it is. And for me, I can't think of a more appropriate use for something that is zoned multifamily, surrounded by conservation area, than to put it to the good use of people being able to come and learn about how beautiful and special the environment is in Indian River County. That's my point of view on it anyway.
Can staff expand on the history of the zoning of this land?
I can give you a little bit as I look at it, and actually have the zoning map up, but it's not displayed. I think generally what was indicated is accurate, that the property under public ownership has been rezoned conservation over the years. The property that's remained in private ownership, including the property owned by the university, has retained the residential designation, and that's how we've gotten to the zoning configuration that we have today.
Actually, I'm Bob Keating, County Community Development Director. For many years, there's been a commercial area along US 1 going to the east to US 1, and to the east of that, the property was all residential going to the river. Probably about 15 or 20 years ago, a developer came in and proposed to develop the property on the north side of Oslo Road, east of the strip center that's there, east of the commercial area. At that time, the St. Johns River Water Management District went in there and purchased the property, and the county cooperated with that. When the property on the north side was purchased, the county did what we normally do when an agency buys property for conservation purposes. We redesignated it conservation on the land use map and rezoned it conservation. Subsequently, the county on the south side bought some property for conservation purposes. We bought the Orca South Link, which is just to the west and to the south of the subject property here. And we also brought, what's the one on the east end, Roland? The Diamond Tract. Yeah, so we bought a bunch of property down there, and I think we bought those with FCT, several of those with FCT. So when we bought those, we changed those to conservation. But basically, the history is it was all multifamily residential for a number of years, and redesignated conservation after it was purchased for conservation purposes.
Thanks.
Anyone else from the audience care to speak on this issue tonight? Anybody else up here have anything?
No, I think today we're here to decide the consistent, compatibility, and the adverse impact. Those are the three criteria that we're here to use. So,
do I have a motion?
Make a motion to approve with staff conditions.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes.
Now the fun begins.
Okay, item 4B, the big one. This is a public hearing, and it's a consideration of the proposed LDRs. And this has been, for some of us who have been here for a couple of years, and for all of the staff, a very, very long process of considering these proposals. A lot of them already have the force of law, as I'm sure Stan will explain to you, but this is the last crack at us opining as to the appropriateness of these new rules and regulations for our county. And so I guess what I'll ask the county to do, since this is not new to any of us, and I know we've read through this and certainly very carefully studied the first section where you explained to us the changes from our last go-around, is to maybe just briefly give us an idea of what your idea of some of the maybe more important changes are, what you think some of the more, from your public meetings and other things, what you think some of the more contentious issues might be, just briefly. And then I would hope to be able to turn it over to us then, for us to, rather than go through each and every change, we can talk about anything we have strong opinions of one way or the other, and then maybe we can, you know, sort the wheat from the chaff. So if that's all right with everybody, let's go on.
All right. I appreciate that, Mr. Chairman. For the record, I'm Stan Bowling, Planning Director. And I know we have at least one person in the audience after going through that procedure that may also have something specific to talk about.
Great.
Just a quick recap, especially for the audience. The planning process that's led us to this point started a few years ago with the evaluation appraisal report of the entire comprehensive plan that identified changes that to be considered to the plan, and those changes were made at the end of 2010, what we call the ear-based comprehensive plan amendments. They were adopted. And this is kind of the last part of the process where we need to make our land development regulations consistent with the comprehensive plan, in some cases providing details of exactly how a policy is implemented. But in addition to those, there are also a lot of cleanups and updates, some staff initiated and at least one board initiated change. And it is a lot of material, and I appreciate your patience. One item that I want to make sure is clear is that these amendments do not include a previous initiative known as the Urban Service Boundary Buffer concept. That initiative actually is now inactive. That's dead, and that's not part of the changes that are under consideration. The Planning and Zoning Commission has looked at the proposed amendments in 3 sets going back to last August and then December and February. We've tried to highlight in our reports where changes were made based on input from the Planning and Zoning Commission. The AAC, otherwise known as the Agriculture Advisory Committee, has looked at some of the proposed changes that really deal with agriculturally designated land and agriculturally zoned land. They looked at it briefly in April, but especially in May. And I'll give you just a little bit of an update so you know what that committee has recommended as well. We had a public workshop on May 11th, and I think the format of that was good. It's much like what the chairman has suggested, focus on issues that people had concerns about. And some changes were made based on that workshop input, and that's highlighted in our staff report to you. We have the hearing here tonight. You all are to make a recommendation to the Board of County Commissioners. You can take a vote on the whole set. You can pull out sections and do separate recommendations, however you all decide you want to handle that. The board has set 2 hearing dates for its consideration. The first one will be June 19th at a regular meeting in the morning, and the second one on July 10th. That'll be a special meeting. It'll be just after 5 o'clock, and they'll probably take final action at that July hearing. As the chairman mentioned, one thing that I really want to emphasize, and we did in the staff report, and we have at a lot of our public meetings, many of the items are already law. They are adopted comprehensive plan policies, And now the LDRs that come behind it can give details and so forth, but the policy is already adopted and it's already in place. And I'll just highlight, there are really 9 of those that I want to focus on, and just very briefly. One is a requirement for buffers for residential projects, new residential projects within the urban service area, to have a buffer where they are adjacent to the agriculture. And the Ag Advisory Committee was okay with that proposal. They also have in their recommendation to look at what I just call a windbreak option, and staff's still doing some review on what the planting specifications for that might be. We have a few concerns that we want to make sure are addressed if that option is added. Allowing biofuel processing plants in ag designated areas, that's a comp plan amendment. We've made some changes based on the August P&Z meeting. Eliminating a single-family perimeter buffer requirement that was added a few years ago. This actually has potentially quite a bit of impact in deleting this buffer requirement just in terms of cost. But essentially, single-family projects are not going to have to buffer themselves from other single-family zoned properties. There's also a requirement for countywide corridor standards, or corridors that have special landscaping, building, and sign requirements. That's a policy. Requiring density transition. When a new development goes in next to an existing residential development that's lower density, there's some kind of transition that's required there. Requiring vehicular and pedestrian connections with exemptions. We have requirements on the books now that require interconnections, but there's basically stronger language in the policy and specific exceptions in the policy, and that's really what the LDRs give a lot more detail on. There's also a requirement to have guidelines and plan developments that deal with keeping projects from looking monotonous, and we had some good workshop input on that. Another is to allow mixed-use projects in certain residential areas where you can have some commercial integrated in with new residential. On also having a requirement for connecting to the county's reuse water system under certain conditions. We had a lot of work on that, a lot of input at the workshop, and I can get into that if we want to discuss that. Also, we looked at some of the development costs, impacts on development costs that were easy to quantify. With residential impacts, we looked at a scenario that we spelled out in the staff report about a typical type of kind of lower density, single family, conventional subdivision development. And when we looked at costs for the proposed active agricultural buffer, the density transition buffer, and then the eliminating the single family buffer, some of those would add costs, and actually the one policy would eliminate costs. And I can get into those anytime you all, if you want to get into that during the discussion time. Also, there are impacts on commercial development. One was pretty easy to quantify, but as we stated in our report, there are other cost impacts, I think, for expanding the corridors that are really difficult to quantify because there's so much variation in building types and what people would build with or without the requirements. But again, we can discuss that if you want. The Ag Advisory Committee, there was, again, the windbreak option that staff is still looking at, adding it to the active ag buffer proposal. They also recommended for water farming and reservoirs, we're proposing those to be permitted uses in agricultural areas. They're going to work on some notice coordination with St. John's with that. They also had 2 other recommendations I wanted to point out. One was a recommendation to make places of worship in agricultural zoning districts, treat them like places of worship in single-family residential districts, and that is to make them a special exception use. Right now, they're a permitted use. They go through site plan approval, but not through the special exception process. They also recommended that for retreats and camps, staff is proposing to make the minimum parcel size for those uses to go from 10 acres to 20 acres. That committee recommended to go to 30 acres. I think staff thinks that there's some merit to these two. So we're considering that being part of our recommendation as well. And staff's recommendation is that the Planning and Zoning Commission recommend the board adopt the proposed LDR amendments, but we would also support those last 2 recommendations from the Agriculture Advisory Committee on the special exception for places of worship and the retreats and camps minimum size. For a couple of reasons I can get into, we decided that 29 acres was maybe a little bit better threshold. just the way parcels tend to get split up in this county. And that's it, Mr. Chairman. I have a few other slides that we can use during discussion that might be of some help.
Okay. Okay. All right. Who wants to begin? Up here.
Sir, are we just going to take them one at a time as they were?
No, I kind of think what would be better, if you'll allow it, is for us to talk about things that we have strong feelings about, first. If anybody has, I know I certainly have strong feelings about several of these proposals, and I'd be happy to begin, but I defer to you guys if someone wants to.
Since they brought up the ag first, I did attend the ACC meeting, so if you all have any questions, I'll try and summarize it. And Bob, the chairman, is out here too, because I know there were some questions about parts of that. So,
well, yeah, the buffer requirement between, I do not understand that. I do not understand the purpose of that, and I'm deeply troubled by the inequity of that. There's no, that is not, it's bad policy. I believe it's bad policy. I think it's unfair, and I will not vote for that. I feel very strongly that it is.
You may be excused.
Yeah, I'm going to have that one. I'm going to just tell. I just want to save time.
If you would like, I'll
tell me the case for it.
Let's hear it.
Here, in a very simple terms, is the reason for this. When you're farming, if you look around our county with the current conditions on agricultural property, there's a going notion that you're holding land for residential development or future development with people. Well, the reality is that may be 5, 10, or 15 years off. You do not know. And so someone who has a pasture, which is exempt in this, you're exempt from, could very well go to row farming. They could, in fact, rejuvenate or replant a grove, which is all of which require spray machines, noise-making equipment. The reality is if you're going to protect a potential business long-term and you're putting houses next to agriculture, then it's not the agriculturalist's responsibility to protect the houses from his property. It's the developer needs to protect it from the agriculture himself.
Well,
inequity though it may be, but that's the whole point. And so the whole purpose of this ag buffer, and I don't know how many they'll even occur, because there are a lot of abandoned pieces of property out there. There are a lot of pastures out there, but there could be those 1, 2, 3, or 4 pieces out there, which I haven't tried to go to identify, that need some protection from homeowners. A perfect example is property out on just south of Walker Glen, the apartments out off 26. There's a bunch of active agriculture just south of them. We actually made a buffer. The apartments dealt with, I thought it was a 50 or 100-foot buffer. We may have ended up at 50, but we actually have a fairly substantial buffer put in at the request of the agricultural people at that time. All this is looking at the reality that may occur if development and houses do not go on those properties in the future. And there's a period of time when you can agriculturally use the property. The type of buffer they're trying to do is get it thick enough so that the homeowners don't see it and therefore don't complain about what's happening next door. There is the alternative buffer proposed is if you've gone out 60, you see all the eucalyptus trees going in, the taller eucalyptus trees. There's a less expensive than a type B buffer. There's a buffer that works very well for the ag. The problem is we buy trees that are very small, let them grow into place. From internally in the buffers in the county, we require certain height commitments. We don't really have nurseries set up with higher eucalyptus and bigger red cedar trees and stuff that would work. But I think it probably could be done, and I think part of that's what Stan's alluding to, is there's a cheaper, inexpensive buffer, satisfies everything that's available, that works actually better maybe, but as an alternative for a developer to kill their costs down. But that's the reason there's a buffer inside the urban service area, is to protect the agriculture that may exist or be processed along the way as these guys change times. Is Syngenta...
Is that what you're alluding to in the second option?
Is Syngenta
Yes, and just for folks that are following along, and I'm sorry, I should have done this at the beginning. We're on attachment 4 in chapter 911 at the bottom of page 5, top of page 6, just for those who are following along. And the option that staff is still researching is this windbreak option that Mr. Hamner referred to, and we're actually trying to get some planting specifications from Syngenta, which I think has had a pretty successful buffer. The concern that staff has about eucalyptus, that might work fine in an agricultural setting with seedlings and so forth, but you know, if there are problems of them holding up to windstorms, you don't want that near a residential backyard. So we want to be, we don't want to encourage that. So we're still looking at that alternative.
Here's what we're talking about. We're talking about farming, which is great. It's the backbone of our community. Hopefully it stays around for a very, very long time. That's their crop. Their neighbor, who may decide that he doesn't want to farm anymore and he wants to develop his land himself or sell it to someone else, then a developer is going to buy that, and his, you know, right off the bat, we've calculated at a minimum it's going to add about $600 to the cost of the purchase price of that home to the person who's buying it. I would say the median house price in this county, just to keep in mind, is about $113,000, and that includes some very expensive houses on the barrier island. So it's not insignificant, and I think it was probably likely much more than about $550 or $600, because the truth of the matter is we're talking about 25 feet along an entire border. That is very significant, and it is quite likely to result in the elimination of lots. I mean, now you're talking about a lot more than $600 per home, and you know, these are probably not going to be terribly expensive homes if they're on the border of our county and so on and so forth. And as I think about this, and I think about what's fair or what's not fair, you know, sometimes it's just a simple exercise to just turn it around. Just turn it around. And just imagine if we were saying to the ag people, you know, we're going to build some homes, and that may be noxious to you. Now, I personally don't think there's any threat to farming from houses. I don't understand that argument in the first place, but let's just assume that it's true in the first place. And they say, then the house people say, we're here, and because we're here and what we're doing here, it may be a threat to you. So what we want you to do is we want you to wipe out 25 feet of your crop on your property, and we want you to spend, I think I've calculated, if it were a 40-acre parcel, it would be about $38,000 putting something in. They would say, I mean, they'd be screaming private property rights to the end of the earth. We'd never hear the end of that.
Yeah, well, you're going to hear it right now, because what you're saying is twofold, and you're right. You do not, and I say this with all due respect, know what you're talking about the ag land complaints, because when you start bringing sprayers in, I can assure you residential people get upset. There's a lot of stuff that happens when you bring stuff in. Active agriculture is next to where people have horses. They complain about stuff. So. Sure. That's the first reality. There are complaints, so whether it's buffered or not, there may or may not be complaints. So we're trying to mitigate that up front. The second thing is, is that the other part of this is we're talking about active agriculture, good or bad, that was there first. Those houses didn't come in. That active agriculture is there. And if the ag guy, if they can sign up and say no to complaints, which they can't, that's great. But the reality is you're bringing houses next door to what is considered active agriculture. And they're not talking about dead land that they don't do anything with. This has to be an active agriculture. It's something that's existing already. And I understand the cost. Believe me, the downside, the discussion occurred about the neighbor who is not active that wants to sell it. Well, someone's going to take it out of someone's hide for that extra $500 or $600 cost per lot in the price of the land when you go to sell it. So the ag guy that owns, or the person that owns that land next door, probably the price would go down, but it's likely to be an ag guy anyway. But the reality is we were only talking about protecting the current agricultural process, well, let me ask you, that's it. One of the things, that's the argument.
This isn't the first time this has come up, and one of the scenarios we talked about was there's two ag guys next to each other. One guy sells out, and he says, "I'm going to sell this." And that very year, they spend $38,000 and put in a buffer. What happens next year when the guy next to him says, "Okay, you know, I'm going to sell out too"? I mean, there's no equity in that. Then someone's just gotten hammered with an expense that wouldn't apply equally to the other person.
But what about when that guy wants to stay in business, and because of those houses, and you've not put any kind of buffer or an inadequate buffer, then he gets lawsuits after lawsuits. He gets sheriff's complaints after complaint. We've already had lawsuits in this county about people spraying in drift. And so you're talking about taking private property rights. If you have just taken away that man's ability to have active agriculture, then maybe he ought to sue for taking. Maybe he ought to.
Has that happened? Has that happened? Has a farmer's right to farm been abridged in Indian River County as a result of overspraying?
No, but it's potential exposure.
Well, I do know, without naming names, there's a grove that we cannot spray the current guava bushes even by hand because the horses are next door. So to move that to kids and make leaps and bounds to other areas is not hard for me to imagine. I can't cite case, but that's the argument, Sam. And you know what? The reality is that as an ag group, we've had both sides of the argument, and I truly do not dismiss your feelings because they were trying to figure out proactively to prevent a potential problem for the guy that really is trying to stay in business and farm. That's what active farming is. It's not pastures. It's not abandoned groves. It's not. That's the reality. It's that. I mean, and there are two sides to this coin, and there's a yes and a no, and all
the other way around. There was no way that the ag guys would allow this cost to be passed on to them. They would make it be passed on to the person who was creating the nuisance. That's my belief. That's what I think.
But it wasn't a nuisance until the houses came in and encroached on, or demanded that they be able to have their rights. I mean, if the guy's actively doing his agriculture or starts up to replants a grove, and because of encroachments for houses, he can't.
How do you protect the active farmer, Alan?
How is the active... That's an assumption built into that question that the active farmer is under threat in this county. Is that true?
Inside the urban service area, doing mechanical equipment use to maintain a piece of property, I would think, yeah, you got problems. You got noise complaints. You have drift. You have potential complaints about the use of pesticides, herbicides next door. Yeah. It goes on. You can't do aerial sprays, that's for sure. So
I have a question, Stan. Currently, if somebody applied today for a permit to put a planned development next to one of these active agricultural areas inside the urban service area, would they have to put the buffer up today if it was put in today?
Yes, because the comprehensive plan policy is adopted. A buffer has to be put in. What we're doing now is dealing with the details of that buffer.
So right now, there's no particular type of buffer.
That's correct. Now, what staff has proposed, previously we had a type B buffer, which included the cost of putting in shrubs. And one of the things that we kind of confirmed with the Ag Advisory Committee, we could drop that part of the normal buffer planting because it really doesn't do much for visually screening and dealing with some degree with the drift and so forth. So that cost is actually, was pulled out. And that requirement was pulled out. So we did try to kind of narrow down to, major on the majors, so to speak.
And is there any way to make it more equitable in this respect? Say, for instance, I apply, I have to put the buffer up, and a year later, the farmer sells his land to another developer. Now he just benefited from all the money I spent on a buffer.
Yeah.
Maybe there needs to be some kind of mechanism triggered that if that farmer sells that property to a developer, that there's a shared cost on that buffer that they're going to both enjoy, and the cost is, the cost would be there for that developer if it was the other way around. So that's what I'm looking at. Maybe you can do something like that. I don't know. I don't know if that's even legal.
That'd be a challenge, I think, as far as that's concerned. The one issue that I wanted to address, Stan, Emerald Estates and Hidden Lake. Emerald Estates came in first. They had to dedicate, was it a
25-foot wide
buffer?
Type B, yes.
Because Hidden Lake had not come in, and it was it active ag at that time?
Hidden Lake was active ag when Emerald Estates was approved. And so Emerald Estates put in their 25-foot buffer and the easement on the plat. And soon thereafter, what was active ag converted to residential project. And now actually we've gone through the process of formally dissolving that easement, that active agricultural easement that's on the plat.
Do you think that eliminated, you were familiar with that site plan?
Yes.
Do you think it resulted perhaps in the elimination of lots? That 25-foot easement along their entire property line?
Actually, I don't think so. I think it does. I think at 25 feet,
Could they have gotten more lots on there if that 25-foot hadn't been there?
we tend to not see maximizing lot sizes in the RS3 district, and that happened to be in the RS3 district. A lot of these probably would be in the RS3 district, but it's certainly the usable area of your rear yard lot depth definitely has an impact. Without the buffer, you could have a pool and screen enclosure, say, go within 10 feet of the rear yard. With a 25-foot buffer, it's now 15 feet further back, and it's 25 feet.
What you're saying is you could shift, if the buffer weren't there, all of the homes, all of the roads could be
go 15
wider
feet. That's correct.
by 15 feet.
That's correct. You're about 15 feet is what's affected with the proposed regulation.
In addition to the cost of the buffer itself.
Certainly.
Stan, I'm just trying to remember in that situation, were the lots on the east side of Emerald Estates, there were still standard size RS3 lots?
Yes.
They had the same length.
Yes.
It's just that they couldn't put a pool at the rear of their yard.
That's correct.
I don't know who puts a pool at the rear of their yard.
We
It's
do.
usually up close to the house.
We do see that. I mean, I think it would have some impact on the usable lot depth. And that's what we said in the report, and that would be our...
But now that 25 feet goes back to the landowner, unencumbered.
Correct.
Fee simple.
That's correct.
Okay.
I think, in fairness to Sam and the rest of you all, this is a clear, there's a clear yay or nay in the sense that the reason this is here is to try and protect what would be active agriculture within the county inside the urban service area, which is there's a buffer. This is defining what is saying. There are going to be costs to the developer next door. It's not going to be fair if the guy sells the land later. You may have lost 2 or 3 lots. I'm not sure. And trying to pick the cost up above just the cost of the buffering itself with potential loss of lots, I think gets even harder. And I say it with all sincerity. This is something you're either for, because I want to support the agricultural crowd, or you're against. I mean, it really is. I hate to tell you, I would rather not go through the 2-hour discussion we had in the ag meeting trying to solve this thing and going over and over again, because I think it's a fairly good, bad, or indifferent. It's a fairly clear, delineated question. And the principal thing is, and I understand Sam's point, that you kind of got to go one or the other.
One of the things that this is, we're looking at 25 feet, where people that are pursuing active agriculture would feel much more comfortable with 50 or 75, and 100 would tickle them to death. 75 would be great. 50 would be, we might make it. 25 is going to be iffy as it is. So unless we want to say we're really looking at the future, that we're not going to have ag within the urban service area, then let's not give them 25 feet. Let's do away with it like Sam, and we'll see that go away.
I think that's a big leap. I think that's a big leap.
Well, I know a family member of mine who was sued because of drift, because of houses that were built next to his grove, and he basically just quit taking care of the grove, because he couldn't afford it.
Yeah, you can't stop litigation.
So I'm going to believe whatever you guys answer me this. I mean, this is really truth time. You're telling me that this vote means whether ag in the urban service district continues to exist or not? I mean, because that's framing it in a different light. I mean, I'm going to have to believe you if you say that, and that's a different kind of issue.
I think he's not exaggerating in certain crops, yes. Yeah. I'm not sure that maybe raising shrimp, there are things out here that there are a lot of ag out here that create problems when you get next to people that sounds romantic, that goes away when you go to the day-to-day operations. It's that simple. That's why the buffer has been asked for. We're all thinking about drift because we spray trees, but...
Stan, you said that you were still talking about the wind mitigation.
The windbreak, yes,
looking at that
as an option.
And the windbreak is to mitigate drift as well, right?
That's correct. It does two things. It would mitigate, at least to some degree, drift, which is why understory tree or canopy tree size is key, but also just visually. if the nuisance factor goes down considerably if there's good visual screening. It just makes for good neighbors generally, and that's certainly the case here. So that's what we're looking for. And the type of windbreaks, they are pretty fast growing, grow close together, and the visual screen is accomplished pretty quickly with the windbreak. We just want to look at the right kind of species. And
so at that point, this concept hasn't made its way into this.
That's correct. We don't have the
narrative.
facts yet, and we're going to continue to do research, and we'll have it in time for the board's consideration.
Right, and the other question that I have is that on the top of page 6, it says in a 25-foot or wider buffer. So you haven't made that decision yet either, right?
Well, 25 feet is the minimum, or wider would be the option of the developer in this case. And what that does is it gives more separation, but it also starts to decrease the number of plants that have to be put in there. There's a trade-off between separation and the planting density itself, and that would be the developer's option.
It's an interesting philosophical debate to say that what your neighbor is doing could cost you money. What your neighbor is doing could cost you money. That's what we're proposing. What your neighbor is doing, and I understand there is something about figuring out what's fair about who was there first. That's important. I'm not sure that's the only thing, but it matters. But the idea that what your neighbor chooses to do with their property is going to affect your wallet and your property rights is kind of troubling to me. And I would say at this point that this proposal is half-cooked. And I think that there are good points on both sides. And I think it should be pulled out and sent back and brought back before this committee before it goes to the Board of County Commissioners. Because I think what's currently proposed is there has to be a better solution. Is not good enough.
The reason for the windbreaks, everything that's there on the windbreaks is actually to relieve that cost, not increase it.
Oh, I agree,
Make
but
it
it's
a better
not part,
windbreak
it's not here.
with less money that works in favor of it. I don't foresee this ever coming back the way it being less than a type B buffer, which is 25 feet and fairly heavily planted. What we were trying to do is relieve that by changing the planting material and changing the type of buffer that would give some relief to that person next door. So good, bad, or indifferent. I mean, we can take it out and go back, but I think whatever you're going to see will be at least a type B buffer because it's the only thing that has any mitigating value for the guy next door. That's why I said philosophically, it really and truly is what you said. It's a yay, nay. I mean, either you're in favor or you're not. And I'm not sure that you need to really think I mean, you kind of got to, everybody gets to lay down on either side of the coin. That's all.
I think there's value in debating the issues, so I respectfully disagree with that. I mean, I know my own mind has been changed somewhat by your guys' assertion that it very well may mean the end of agriculture inside the urban service district.
Certain types, definitely. Citrus.
That's a big...
Any vegetable farming.
Anything with spray.
Anything with spray.
Yeah.
Maybe even to some degree livestock.
Well,
maybe not,
mitigating.
but
Livestock pastures are out of this. That's not something you have to do.
And you're saying there is nothing less than a $38,000 solution for a 40-acre lot. There's nothing, because it's a big ask that you're asking. Philosophically, it's a big ask. Monetarily, it's a big ask. In terms of what we normally consider, to be fair, in terms of where the costs should lie and how neighbors affect each other. I mean, this is outside the bounds of what we would normally say. And maybe that's okay, because maybe it's a life or death situation, and that's why we should consider it that way. Are you telling us that your read from the AAC is that it's 25 feet and $38,000 or nothing? That's the answer?
I'm afraid so.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, the cost of increasing development is nothing new. I mean, our code is rife with it. I mean, we make them put in a certain thickness of road because we want a good quality road so we don't get complaints. We make them put in a good lift station because we don't want sewage backing up and having people that can't use their sewage facilities. I mean, there's nothing new of buffering. We have buffering all over the place in our code as far as having it between different types of land uses, commercial versus residential, multifamily versus single family. So the idea of buffering is nothing new. It's nothing illegal as far as extracting or forcing a developer to dedicate part of their property to buffering between uses as far as an eminent domain standpoint. It's certainly abundant in the code.
You got somebody that wants to speak.
In light of that, were there any other questions about, there were the churches, there's some other parts of this in this first that's may or may not be of issue, and I'd be happy to go, we can go through them as well, but this may be the defining issue in the ag chain LDR.
I think it is, for me.
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, it's a public hearing, so if you want matters from the public, you might want to open the public hearing and take the...
We're opening the public hearing.
Very good.
Come on down, state your name and address for the record, please.
Sure. Robert Adair, 7060 33rd Street, and also Chairman of the Agriculture Advisory Committee. I guess I have some direct information because I actually have a grove that's inside the urban service area, and we do receive complaints. I'd like to point out that people that are actively in agriculture, wherever you are right now, if you're not spraying 10 to 12 times a year, you're not going to survive the greening disease. And virtually every single grove in the county has citrus greening disease. And this is an agricultural county. When we purchased our land in 1986, we weren't inside the urban service area because it didn't exist. It was agricultural land. And so we set up a research station to look at different citrus diseases, which we're doing now, and it's called the Florida Research Center. So I have direct information. So for us, inside the urban service area, we also abut up to it. And currently, if you'll look at your attachment 4 on page 5, where land butts up to the urban service area, you've approved and have language for a 50-foot buffer and a setback with a 6-foot opaque feature, and I believe a type B buffer also. Right. So I was arguing several years ago, or trying to build the logic to have a 50-foot buffer, whether you're inside the urban service area, butt up to it, adjacent to it, or wherever, so that you could actually preserve to do that operation. So our situation would be that we would be adversely impacted without a buffer, I can assure you that. There's another factor that mitigates, the setback mitigates sound. And the biggest problems we have is generally a perception based on the person who's complaining. They hear the sound, they come out to see what's going on, and then they might smell something, or they might actually witness a spray on their windshield if they're on a highway or something like that. So there has been complaints with us where we are, and we're very concerned because at the property line, when you drive your tractor and you make your end turns around, your sprayer's turned off because you're not going to blow it where there's no trees on that one side. So we're real concerned that 25 feet probably isn't adequate, but to take it away would be a disaster, I can assure you. And basically, I've got a little, so I could present this on the overhead, is basically, I think you need to understand how loud an air blast sprayer is. We're talking almost 100 decibels. And I'd like to point out that our operators are wearing hearing protectors, because anything above 85 decibels can cause hearing loss. This decibel reading that you see here was real time. It was taken by the Department of Health at the state of Florida at 40 foot away, was 98.4 decibels. I'd like to show you the difference of a schematic, looking at two different types of buffers. We could zoom back just a hair. If on the top, is it possible, do I need to do it? Thank you. On the top that you see here, this would be the 25-foot, which I was under the impression that's currently in place. You can see how close, and this white cone here is not spray. This would be the sound coming out of the sprayer. That turbine that's at the back to blow that air is actually a detuned siren. The aerodynamics of that, so it's very, very loud, plus the sound of the diesel. So you could see how you can uplift with an opaque structure, how you can actually lift that sound up, and that's the key. So it's noise, odor, and spray drift. Stan says correctly, yes, there's a visual thing. You don't see the tracker, you don't see the sprayer, but you're going to hear it. So noise is a huge, huge factor in that. And you can see the same type of thing in an overhead view. Now, I'd like to point out in our particular operation, the reason I'm so familiar with buffers, I feel like it's my middle name, we have two different housing projects that came in on us. Walker Woods developed after, while we were as a set-up grove. They came in, they have a 50-foot buffer with a 6-foot earthen berm, and then Walker Avenue Clubs has a 50-foot buffer with a 6-foot earthen berm. I haven't received any complaints from those. Where I'm receiving the complaints from is Trillium to the east of our property, and apparently it's the sound, and they're concerned about it. I don't know why it is, but that seems to be where the people are coming from. So I just want to make sure you understand. We have a member of our committee, interestingly, was outside the urban service area. A church came in next to them, and they basically have abandoned their groves, and they're farming other land that they have out in the marsh. I just got to tell you, it's very real to me. And I want to make sure you understand that. And if there's any questions you can think of, I'd be happy to deal with that. I can tell you that in the Agricultural Advisory Committee, that there were members that were wanting to make that distance longer than 25 feet, including myself. There was another member. But we were trying to make something that was doable, and that's why we ended up at the 25-foot. So I was here tonight to ask you to consider 50-foot to assure that you can have a viable agriculture. And there's a lot of benefits to having these in the urban service area and green space. So I think you want to be careful about what you do that could really affect somebody's livelihood and business. And a lot of our work has been very valuable on some of the insect pests, and that would really create a hardship for us. I can say that.
Can I ask you the same question? This makes a difference for me. Do you think that this issue, the way this vote would go, if this were to be defeated, which I don't think it will be, but do you think it would mean the end of farming inside the urban service district? Would it have that kind of a profound effect?
I know a person who sold their groves and got out of it because of complaints. I know a person who was a caretaker that shut his business down, got out of it because his insurance coverage, they paid it because there was a perception that somebody got harmed by the spray. And by the way, I don't believe it. They do not do the caretaking business anymore. And our situation, the perception with research, even though we're sustainable research using non-toxic sprays, I think there could be some real adverse consequences.
So I have a question.
Sam, ag guys are resilient.
Yeah.
They figure out things to do. So, I mean, it puts Bob and guys in citrus in a tough spot to say, oh, it's just going to wipe them out. Well, the reality is there's something else.
No, I hear what he's saying.
But
I hear what he's saying.
For the people that spray on a lot of crops, it's a big problem.
Yeah, no.
So will the compromised 25 feet buffer work and do its job to minimize or
I've already
any
got 50
exposure?
foot on one piece on the property that's around us to the south.
Sure.
And that was done through this type of process, and I feel that was pivotal to our survival. That we have, that earthen berm works, it works. I'm scared the 25 foot might not work. If you take that away, I know it won't. Yeah. I can say that.
At 25 feet, you're fluctuating between the 25 feet and 50 feet. Can you achieve the same desired results at 25 feet by increasing the vertical height? I mean, you're talking about two things. You're talking about drift and you're talking about noise. So probably the noise mitigation at between 25 and 50, there's probably a difference there. But what about drift? Can you go vertical and cut that drift?
I think the drift is easier to mitigate than the noise. I will tell you this, that the way to get a buffer to work, and this has been done in California, all this work that we've done, and Stan and Bob, we've become buffer experts because we've been doing this now for at least 15 years. This is nothing new, okay? Where it all started was in California because of the explosive growth. There was a problem right at the urban service area boundary, and that's where a lot of these buffers started. But what I will tell you is that if you look at Syngenta's buffer, which is a good one, they have red cedar, which is a low-growing evergreen, and they have a Torrelliana, which is a type of eucalyptus. This is a much more sturdy type of eucalyptus. It grows very fast. In 1 year, it can be 15 to 20 feet tall. By putting 2 or 3 structures in there and creating like a pyramid or a triangle of having 2 or 3 different stories, that's the trick. With all due respect, taking out the shrubs may not be a good idea because you want that foliage to intercept and deflect that sound. I've heard the difference in sound when the buffer's taken out because the electric company came and pulled trees out from under the thing. You could hear the difference in noise. So the noise amelioration is real. It's real.
So can you...
And the wider the buffer is, the more amelioration. The more leaves you have, he's a horticulturalist, Mr. Tripson, the more leaves you have and intercept and deflect that sound.
So if you go with that 3-tiered structure, the shrubs, the red cedar, and the eucalyptus, if you go with that 3-tiered design, will that work at 25 feet?
Well, then the person comes out of their back door and they're walking into the buffer. So my sense is if you did 50 foot and you have 25 foot where you can't build and they can put a patio or whatever they're going to do, at least you have some spatial distance between the house and the edge of the property line. And the question I would ask, how close do you want to build a house to a citrus grove? I mean, seriously, what are we talking about? I thought 25 foot was where it is. Is it 15? That's a question for staff.
Bob, wouldn't it be fair? I mean, this was part of the discussion in that meeting. I'm not on the committee. I just went to listen. That was the feeling, and one of the reasons the windbreaks came up is that if it's only 25 feet and you can tier it thinking about the red cedar trees and something higher, then the chances of working are much higher than simply having shrubbery and small trees or oak trees that may look better down the road, but you try and create a truly working buffer. Mm-hmm. That was the thought process behind that, and the suggestions. The dilemma is getting the size up and grown.
But for perspective, what is the setback, Stan or Bob?
Okay, just a couple things real quick. The reason that there was the ability to do a 50-foot buffer by Mr. Adair's Grove is there were planned developments that came in, and they were basically multi-family, so there's a little more flexibility in terms of siting the unit and so forth. But in a lot of cases, we think this would apply for a conventional single-family subdivision, and that's why we're talking about lot sizes and so forth. And in RS3 district, which is most of the cases, the building setback is 25 feet, so it'd be 25 feet in the rear yard. But pools and pool enclosures can come within 10 feet of a rear property line. Now, if you put a 25-foot buffer there, that's a 15-foot difference, basically from where the pool and pool enclosure could go if you put it in the backyard, which is pretty much the common practice.
Huge. Right.
Thank you.
Mr. Adair, what types of pesticides, herbicides, fungicides would be sprayed now in your typical active grove, and how often?
10 to 12 times per
The non-toxic variety.
You don't have time tonight.
Yeah, basically every spray with the psyllid, which is the vector of the citrus greening disease, we're putting out about 10 sprays. The materials are all approved by the EPA, the University of Florida. We're using materials like spray oils. Those are non-toxic. It's petroleum spray oils and baby oil. It's a petroleum oil.
I think the answer to that is you're spraying every 16 to maybe 21 days.
And what do you spray? Fungicide?
You put fungicides out, you have plant foliar sprays, fertilization on the trees, or steroids. There's a lot of different chemicals that are used and/or products that are used for different pests. You're in the middle of your growing, this is the tropics, you're in the middle of your, potentially your worst growing on insects, et cetera. That's what we're having to deal with right now. You take the target insect and choose the program that goes with it.
We're spraying insecticides, bactericides, fungicides, and fertilizers. And a lot of those are non-toxic. A lot of them kill directly insects, but don't have mammalian toxicity.
Is there a difference between what you're spraying as far as an insecticide and what mosquito control goes down the street and sprays?
Yeah, yes.
Well,
yes,
the
very much.
spinosad is very similar.
Because of the size of you're targeting mosquito with malathion.
You're going to have to ask Dr. Day, but some of our materials are similar to those. And the new strategy right now is low toxicity. That's being mandated, and the pesticide companies are doing a really good job in that, and we're exploring some in other ways.
We're trying our best to keep the integrated pest management, IPM, is integrated pest management, which keeps your spraying as low as possible and allows friendlies to exist that wasp at stuff that actually help kill bugs as well. So you're trying not to kill what you got in the grove that works for you at the same time as to eliminate the pest.
George, you may have been right. I think this is just an issue, and I got to tell you, I'm gonna man up. I'm gonna say that I sure as hell didn't know what I was talking about. And I once heard someone say that if you can't change your mind, are you sure you don't have one? And I'm changing my mind on this. I think this makes a lot of sense. I thank you for explaining it to me. I didn't know the stakes were quite as high as they were. You won't get any more negative comments from me on this proposal as currently drafted. And if anybody would like to have a motion, we can move on.
Make a motion to approve?
All in favor? Oh, we need a second.
Second.
All in favor?
And that motion would be to approve attachment 4.
Correct.
The changes to 911, 912.
Correct.
To clarify for the record. Thank you.
Right. Okay. Thank you for your patience on that. We're ready to move on to the next one?
Still need to vote.
Need to vote.
Oh, we didn't, yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, a vote. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Anybody else got a problem with anything else?
On any of the others?
Yeah, let's just move on to the other ones. Let's talk about the density buffer next. The density buffer, you guys want to kind of generally describe to us how that's written, what it's meant to do? It's similar in some ways, so it's probably a good thing to transition to at this point. Stan, can you
Sure,
help us out?
be glad to.
And what attachment are we working on now?
Attachment 6, page 14.
6, 8, and 14.
Attachment 6, page 14.
I have a question on 8.
Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, the density transition area is something, for obvious reasons, once it's explained by Mr. Bowling, also troubles me deeply.
This particular item comes from a policy that's actually been in the comprehensive plan before the EAR-based amendments. And it's a requirement that where a residential development is located adjacent to an existing residential development at a lower density, that there needs to be some type of density transition area. And the way staff has structured the proposed land development regulation, there can be either an area next to that lower density border where lot sizes or units are changed, pulled away. There's actually physically less density on that particular side of the residential development, or a buffer can be placed. The reason we put in the buffer option is for multifamily projects, many times it's not that difficult to pull some of the units away from one particular side of the property. That could be where you have perhaps stormwater or other uses. You could even have open space or recreation there, common areas. It has much more of an impact on single family, especially conventional single family development. And again, staff's view is that actually providing a 25-foot wide type B type of buffer, where you have a canopy tree and understory plantings, you do have an improved kind of green space area, and that is a transition. So it's a way of trying to give a developer an option to just simply having to design fewer lots, especially for single family, but also would have the ability for multifamily to kind of pull the units away from the low density border that they have.
Let me ask a question to clarify the point. It's a similar sort of situation that we were talking about in the last case. So there's two neighbors next to each other. Let's just get real. And let's say they're zoned, give me a low density.
They could both be zoned RS6.
They're both zoned RS6. They're 10 acres each. Let's make them 40 acres each. And the first guy just says, I'm going to develop my property, but you know what? I'm going to put 1 home per acre on my property. That's all I want to do. That's my right. I'm not going to develop up to the maximum density. This is what I want to do. Now, the next guy comes along 3 years later and he says, you know what, I've owned this property. It's been in my family for a long time. I've got a great idea for a really beautiful development. He's going to walk into your office and he's going to find out, much to his chagrin, that his density is not 6 units to the acre. It's something that's a blend of 6 units to the acre and what his neighbor did. Is that correct? I mean, with the escape hatch of him spending $38,000 for a 40-acre, but we just learned that. We learned what that cost is, right? So that's really what we're talking about. That's how.
And
that's
thank
how
you
it
again.
That's correct. You could have the same, you're right. I completely agree with you. You have two neighboring properties that have the same zoning. One, for whatever reason, especially it's going to happen with older subdivisions, perhaps, that didn't have water and sewer at the time. They have half-acre lots or what have you. They're platted. They've been there for a while. You come in next to one of those, it's certainly going to essentially cost more money to develop that property any more dense.
Is this good public policy, do you think?
What did we do with Doctors Row on the south side of Doctors Row, what I call Doctors Row, and 12th Street? We backed up with a...
Yes.
Behind where Tripson's house was, we backed in and we did a development
Oaks
in
and
there.
Bureau PD.
And it was a PD.
Yes.
And I remember having an audience full of people, and we
had deeper lots adjacent to those, but again,
you hammered them.
And I think this type of buffer would be kind of normal actually for PD. It's probably not going to affect the
PD,
but conventional
PD's
development.
PD's a whole different
It is.
world.
But the point was is that I think that this has come up several times, and I'm pro buffers as a person, but the reality is that I think that was why we're here, was trying to mitigate this ahead of time.
No, but think about this situation. I mean, the thing we're going to get to next is interconnected. We want to interconnect neighborhoods. I know, we're going to hit that one. That's a good one.
I thought it was dead.
I tried to kill that one a lot. But think about the principle of interconnecting neighborhoods, right?
I understand.
Of the same zoning, similar zoning. I mean, surely that would make the most amount of sense. I mean, on the one hand, we're saying we're going to do that. On the other hand, we're saying we have to have, at a minimum, a 25-foot buffer or some kind of much blend. I mean, there's one guy's just reaching into the other guy's pocket, by what he chooses to do. And he's free to build at a lower density. That's great if he does that. But how in the world can that affect what his neighbor's rights are to develop his property? That doesn't make any sense to me. I mean, at least in the ag thing, it's certain, once you explained it to him, it made sense. There's a real nuisance there that has to be mitigated. What's the nuisance here?
Oh. Wait, I'm sorry.
Are you talking about the place you used an example of that? Are you talking about at my parents' house and on the place that went in on the west side of it?
Yes.
Well, that's a good idea, Sam, and it's a shame that we couldn't have got you to ride down there and look. But my family has, my parents' house is an acre, and my brother's house is an acre, and then the old dairy building was 8 acres. And on the west side of that, and they put in, 3 houses per acre in that subdivision?
Correct.
Is what basically it ended up.
Close to it.
And thank God my mother died before they built
Now
that
let's not get overboard now.
Well, because she would have been horrified if that buffer wasn't there. Somebody who had lived on that piece of property since she was born, and you put in 3 units to the acre right next to her, where she's had a house on 1 acre and basically 8 acres of open space.
Yeah, but she doesn't own her neighbor's property. She owns her property.
That's true, but the encroachment.
There's no encroachment.
Perceived. Sure, there
I don't want to get to the point where we have first come, first served property rights here in Indian River County.
Thank you.
I don't think that should
Okay.
be, that should not be a policy.
Then look at it from an aesthetic point of view, that I have been able to look at trees, and now I am forced to look at houses.
You're,
to look at houses.
You're not forced to. Your view is what your land consists of. Everything else around it, that's somebody else's view in their property. Say if I have a house on the river just off the point. I only have a one-story. The gentleman next to me puts up a two-story house with balconies, and my house sets back further than his. Am I going to tell him he can't build that house because he's blocking my view? That's not my view, that's his view.
Okay.
And that's the way I perceive this. I said, I really do not believe in first come, first served property rights.
Let me ask you this. You guys are professionals. Give us an opinion. Is this good public policy? Is this typically what you'd want to see in a zoning code, or is this outside the bounds of what we would normally consider good public policy that we expect to see in a land development regulation?
This is essentially reality. This is what we deal with constantly. The Oaks of Vero is a perfect example. When we get development projects, we get neighbors in, and what they're looking for is essentially along the edge some kind of compatibility. Yeah, I think from our perspective, no, it isn't what staff did not recommend the density transition.
What would be your top two reasons for why you would not recommend that, that this would be the case? Or what maybe the top one? I mean, what is the kernel of this being a bad idea?
Because you really don't need to buffer, say, single family to single family, even if lot sizes are bigger in one project than another. And I think that's the reason you wouldn't need this. But the bottom line is, it is a policy in the comp plan, and right now we need to either put in a land development regulation that implements that policy, or the board needs to.
Let me ask you a question. Do you believe that the problem, because you said it's reality, that exists when this happens, do you believe that this cure, the cost of this cure, is appropriate? I mean, I think I've determined that with the ag thing, it was an appropriate cost for the size of the nuisance or discomfort of the neighbor. In this case, do you believe that the cost-benefit analysis is a fair one? Is this a fair one? I don't. What do you think?
I think it mitigates some of the perceived impacts.
Well, it certainly does that, but at a cost.
Right.
Is the cost, do you believe that the cost in this case exceeds the size of how much this troubles the people who have, decided to develop their land at a lesser density? Are they so inconvenienced? Is this such a serious societal problem that we're going to pretty seriously impact the property rights of the neighbor? Or is that a cost that goes beyond what the real problem is?
Well, actually, I think the cost can be avoided in a lot of cases. Any developer can do a PD, and with a PD you can have a lot more flexibility, and you could essentially avoid the cost.
But if the neighbors really had a problem, they'd come into the PD and they'd say, there's no way this guy's going to do this. I mean, you could even open up a bigger bag of, it could be a bigger problem that way, because, man, then it's not just rules, it's a free-for-all.
The reality, though, is, and this is I understand the concerns that you all have, but the simple fact is that on most PDs, this is fairly standard fare. So why are we asking people in PDs to do this if we're not asking it conventionally?
I think
if we don't believe it's helping or worth the cost. So
I think the difference there, and Bob was right, PDs, we see this sort of thing all the time, but there is a trade-off. The developer is getting some waivers from the normal conventional rights. Right. And this would apply, and does, because again, it's adopted policy. It does affect conventional subdivisions and conventional site plans. And I think the biggest impact to this is a conventional subdivision because of the lot depth situation.
I mean, we're talking about interconnectedness and whether that, I mean, the philosophy of interconnectedness, we may remove the reality of that, I hope. We're talking about the philosophy of interconnectedness. We've just removed buffers between single-family, things because we thought that was bad policy. Our own staff has just told us they did not recommend this policy. Yeah. I mean, guys, let's not make bad policy. Let's not make bad policy. Let's send this back to formula. This is bad policy. And I think we all know it in our heart, and it's a pain to send it back, but man, this is wrong. This is just wrong. That's my strong feeling about it. This is wrong. Bad policy.
Is there any other workable alternatives that helps implement the actual plan?
I think the alternatives, I think Bob alluded to this, I mean, either the comprehensive plan policy needs to be changed. Maybe it's changed just to make it an aspect of PDs. When you've got a PD, you're doing trade-offs. One of the trade-offs is going to be the density transition. But that would require a change to the comprehensive plan.
That would change.
Or just to eliminate the policy altogether. I think your recommendation is to make a recommendation on the LDR amendment, but if you recommend to not have a regulation, I think you would need to also recommend that the board eliminate that policy. You've either got to make the LDRs consistent with the policy, or you've got to eliminate the policy.
Okay, so those are the two options.
And it's doable. It is doable. We can recommend it.
You can certainly, yes.
We can recommend it, and then there's a procedure for having that occur.
Correct.
Okay.
But you really can never have too much buffering.
Well, I've kind of come around to looking at Sam's point of view on this, but I don't know what the alternative is. So this, if we recommend that the board change it, then this is going to go on for 6 more months or however long, and require a change in the comp plan as well. Well, this is requiring a change in the comp plan anyhow, right?
Well, this is
bringing it into compliance with the comp plan. Okay.
Yeah, change to the LDRs, right?
Yeah.
So
maybe that's the way to go.
It's bad policy. It's bad policy. It's a stinker.
All right, let's vote.
So I am going to make a motion that we approve, I guess, no, that we take out the density transition area. We go back.
Future land use element policy 1.48.
Thank you very much. And that it be stricken from the LDRs.
From the comp plan.
From the comp plan. Thank you.
So what's the process involved if we were to stricken it from the LDRs?
What would likely occur is...
I second it.
The Board of County Commissioners, when they take a look at the P&Z's recommendation, if they agree with it, they would direct staff to file an amendment to the comprehensive plan, which will probably occur this coming July. That's the next window.
Okay.
And then it would take about 8 to 9 months to change the comp plan policy.
And when that happens, we'll have public hearings
Correct.
on it.
You'll
and
see it again,
We'll
yes.
get to hear the people that actually probably maybe are affected or about to be affected by this transition area, right?
Yeah, that's good. That'd be a good thing.
Yeah.
I think that'd be a good thing. Any more discussion on this motion? We ready for a vote?
Was there a second?
Yes, I seconded it.
Okay.
All in favor, say aye.
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 Any opposed?
Aye.
Who opposed?
Meaning that I like buffers, and that's all it means.
Got it. Thank you. Do you want to? Okay, so that's that.
There was just Mr. Hamner opposed?
Yes.
Just
And
Mr. Hamner opposed.
nothing unusual.
I have a question on attachment 8 on page 15, and this is about country clubs.
Wait a minute, don't be getting into the 1%er.
What page? 15?
Page 15. With what's stricken there under number 1, such facilities may include restaurants with alcoholic beverage license. And so we've taken out the 1,000-foot requirement?
That's correct. And the reason we have done that is because our alcoholic beverage code in the county has been changed since this was put in many years ago. So we're trying to make this criterion consistent with another section of the county
Right.
code that already deals with the same issue.
And so what is the distance now with that we're trying to conform to?
It's the state standard of 500 feet to a school.
So it's 500 feet, okay.
Of a
Very
school.
good. Thank you.
School, correct.
500 feet of a school, right.
You can have church and bars now if you want.
Right.
And there are places where that does occur.
Amen. Can we talk about the interconnections, the thing we've been trying to kill forever and it just keeps coming back? Do you want to explain that briefly to us and then we'll talk about that?
Which attachment?
Stand there.
Attachment 7, I believe it starts on page, the bottom of page 25 and then goes to, the top of page 26. And this again is necessary because we do have a comprehensive plan policy that was discussed pretty thoroughly by P&Z and the board at one
Did
point
we get
together.
outvoted on this again?
What's that?
Did the board outvote us? Because I thought we killed it here.
I mean, I know there was a lot of dislike on this dais when
That's
we
correct.
talked about it before. I mean, we were against it 2 or 3 times.
Question is the exceptions, I guess, now.
Yeah, I think one of the things that did come out of the discussion was to, and again, like I said before, we do have, and I've got plenty of examples, I got slides of examples if you want to look at commercial and residential, if you want to look at any specific, if that helps the discussion or not. But we already have some requirements in place for requiring stub outs and with subdivisions, new roadways and so forth. But this actually puts a little more teeth into it, the comp plan policy does, and the comp plan policy has a lot of these exceptions in it. What we added was the last exemption under 3D, that's on page 26, kind of toward the bottom, for kind of what we kind of came up with is low density, low benefit type of situations could be exempt. But, excuse me, the idea
26.
is for both commercial and residential developments to provide some connectivity where there can be some local driveway or local street opportunities and connections for the development so that you don't have to get back out onto a main roadway, that you don't have to make, and again, I've got pictures I can show you if you want specific examples, going through and having to go through intersections back onto busy roadways and making turns in that to make it not only for vehicles but also for pedestrians. So we also have the traffic calming item in. The board has actually approved traffic calming guidelines that are maintained by the Public Works Director, and those are referenced in the LDRs as well. Again, that's it in a nutshell. There are exemptions for where this interconnection would not be required. For instance, if the connection, basically, you'd be dead ending into environmentally sensitive land, existing platted property, there's not a way to really connect it to anything. If you were to actually funnel commercial traffic through one residential street, we would not want to create that kind of funneling effect. And then, like I said before, in a low density to low density and a low benefit area from a traffic standpoint, that would be exempted as well.
But a normal new subdivision going in next to a normal new subdivision, there would be no more, this is your community, strangers aren't driving through here, this is, basically the pattern of development that the United States has had for the last 15 or 20 years. What you have in mind is more of a grid system like the 50s, the new urbanism. That's what would be the result, inevitably, of this policy, with very few exceptions.
No, I wouldn't say very few. I think there are quite a few exceptions, because a lot of times I think you actually have, even the area that's left in the urban service area developed, a lot of times there are already existing platted subdivisions, so there's not an opportunity to stay on one side to interconnect. I think what it leads to is probably more shared entrances, shared driveways. We've had examples of that with different projects, and that actually take years to kind of build out and to use. So I think you're going to have with this probably more shared streets and shared
Just
driveways in
remembering
those
the
cases.
discussion we had before, and I can't believe that we would have let this go. I'm surprised that it's so intensely built in the plan, the land development plan, or the ERA, whatever we did, the long-term plan, because I thought this board said no.
Right, and we had with the EAR, you may remember in 2010, August maybe, there was a joint workshop between the Planning and Zoning Commission and the Board of County Commissioners, so you all could talk directly to each other without the benefit of staff being the
I'm just
in-between.
curious, when it got with did the Board of County Commissioners want this in?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, well.
And it is in.
And if we do not like this, what do we need to remove?
I think you're back to a recommendation on comprehensive plan policies, future land use element policies 1.54, 4.5, and 4.6.
I would not say that, because I don't have a problem with the commercial part. I think the commercial part of it is eminently sensible, and I think you guys do need to have the stick to make commercial properties have to interconnect. I think it's just a reality, and it's a very reasonable thing, but for everything relating to residential.
That's the problem. The commercial's never been a problem. Right.
I mean, because I look at the way the big intersections have happened, you know, where the new Lowe's, the Home Depot, and there's the McDonald's there, and there's a CVS. That's all interconnected, and thank goodness, because there's no way you could get back, you'd be jumping in that busy intersection. That wouldn't work. Thank goodness you have the ability to do that. But for residential.
So do we maybe recommend to the county commissioners that we want to keep commercial, but do away with mandatory residential interconnectivity?
Yes, I think that would be your recommendation.
You want to turn that into a motion?
Sure, I'll make that motion. Excuse me.
I'll second.
You're going to lose.
Any discussion?
Just to clarify the motion, then the recommendation is for the board to take a look at the policies, as the comp plan policies, as well as the LDR, and apply it to commercial, but not to residential.
Correct.
Exactly right. No interconnectedness for residential.
Unless the people want to be.
And then they'll do that.
Give 'em,
Freedom, man. It's a great thing. Okay, so we have a motion and we have a second. Is there any further discussion? Or
The second was Mr. Emmons?
Yes.
all in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passed.
Just for the record, staff still won't make the arguments we made before. They're still there.
Right.
They're there.
You guys are academics. I love you.
Actually, I drive around this county quite a bit.
A lot.
Mr. Chairman, can we get 5 real quick? 5 minutes?
Let's take a 5-minute break.
Thank you.
Have all those roads connecting, all those, they're actually kind of different neighborhoods, especially if you get into Atlantic Avenue, but you can't just go from one to the other. I think the thing is, the perceived notion that having a gated community protects you from crime more than a regular, the sheriff will tell you it ain't true.
want that density transition to go away, tell the guy, you have the developer create it, put in a nudist colony. Yep. I didn't see that exemption.
Then we're right back to interconnected.
Right. I mean, you can.
Yeah, you should. You just broadcast that to the whole community.
Jenza, you should say things like that.
Okay, we're back. We're back. So again, I'm reminding everyone if there's any other large issues that that we ought to talk about tonight, anything else that's on your mind as you read through this thing that is you don't understand or that is troubling. We've hit some big ones. You know, let's keep going. Let's keep going.
Actually, for the most part, I mean, these other things, I wasn't sure about the reconnection, but I assume that that's if water's available. I mean, it's not, these others we're pretty much have been doing anyway, hadn't we?
Yeah, I think so. I think generally a lot of the changes that you see there, some of the clarifications, updates, we went through all of that, and we're actually adding uses and a little more flexibility for some property owners in some zoning districts. So
I mean, that we aired the mixed use part out, I mean, hard when it came out.
That's very detailed in the comp plan, and the LDR changes almost word for word.
The biofuel we took care of earlier, but I mean, that was large and small. The countywide corridor, I really thought we had enacted that, but because of the making all the, like, State Road 60 corridors, I thought that had been done.
But I wanted to ask about that, and if you'll let me. The comp plan said countywide, and you guys have properly interpreted that to mean countywide on thoroughfares of a certain size and
in a certain area, correct.
Can you show me the map of which ones those are? I just, because
it's the major thoroughfare.
You have sent me the corridor special development regulations. It's real. I mean, there's a lot of stuff in here.
There is.
And there's a lot of details. And wow, all that red is it?
Well, let me explain. The red that you see is the commercial industrial designated areas. So so you can see what's commercial on there. Then the rest is residentially designated inside the urban service area, which is kind of that stippled, kind of cross-hatched portion. Now, the existing corridors are outlined in the in purple. I'm sorry, purple. What am I saying? It's blue and green.
Yes.
And then the proposed other corridors go through a lot of areas that are zone residential. So it's really going to be, applying to non-residential buildings in those areas, such as, if a church were to go in, a daycare. A lot of those are the east-west roads, like 8th Street, 4th Street, 1st Street Southwest as you go south. Basically, south of State Road 60, the collector roadways east of 58th Avenue, and then north of State Road 60, the collector roadways that are east of 66th Avenue. And again, it's primarily going to affect non-residential development that occurs, and you can see most of these areas are in residentially designated areas. Some go through the red or commercial industrial areas, so it will be affecting more properties in those areas.
Okay, so these are questions not to challenge, but to educate, because it's a big, I see now that it's a lot of roads. And normally, my idea of a corridor plan where it's most appropriate is on the main things. I mean, you'd certainly want to see it on Ocean Drive. You'd want to see it in places where the rent is high, where it makes a lot of sense to do that. I get a little questionable about how much of a public benefit it is in regards to the cost, where we get out onto secondary and tertiary roads. And having read through this entire thing, which the standards they're nice ones, but they're high. They're high standards, something we would like to see on Route 60, but I don't know if necessarily all the rest of them. And so I hope you'll indulge me. I've done some commercial development myself. I read through this. I saw the commercial development that I've done are Starbucks. And the reason I think this is a good example is because they only take the most expensive properties, they charge the absolute highest rents, and their buildings are very expensive to build. And as I read through this, I'm not sure, but I looked at some pictures of some of the ones that I've developed around the state of Florida, and I don't think they would meet this criteria.
They will change.
They would not meet it. I mean, and some of the rules I think are silly. I mean, really silly, and it makes me wonder if we can't put a Starbucks of the quality. I mean, that's the highest, that's a very expensive building on a very expensive land. If we can't put that on 49th Street or something like that, are we headed in the right direction? I mean, does that make sense? I don't know. I mean, I could see it being for the main thoroughfares, a nip and a tuck here and there. But, when I went through it, I think there were problems. I don't think any of my buildings, and I'd be happy for you to put them on the thing, I don't think they would go with the foundation planning. I don't think this is commercial prototype building according to the code. This is definitely a building that Starbucks gives me the plans for, so it is, that would right there be outlawed. It says no, this is a silly little thing, it says no stack bond masonry. This building has as a decorative feature very expensive stack bond masonry. It talks about awnings. I'm not sure these buildings comply in terms of the awnings. It talks about wall pack lighting. These buildings do have wall pack lighting on them. The site lighting poles are the wrong color. The signage, it's hard to tell because it's from page 15 to page 21, or the signage ordinance just goes on and on. The parking, it says that needs to have an island every 5 spaces. I am certain that these do not have an island every 5 spaces. And again, I get back to the idea that, these buildings are so expensive to build that unless you're selling brown water at $4 a cup, $1,000 an hour, you can't even be in these locations in these types of buildings. So if it's not appropriate what they're putting there, why are we putting such high standards on roads that are not our primary thoroughfares? They're secondary or tertiary at best. Does that make sense, or are we just so severely curtailing economic development by having standards that a rent could never pay for that type of development? Is that a public good?
That was a lot of questions.
Yeah,
I'll be glad to weigh in.
I'm thinking out loud. I'm thinking out loud.
Sure. No, and I appreciate that. A couple of things. We've had a lot of experience, over 15 years of experience with quarter, again, applying to commercial, but also institutional, churches, things like that. We've not run across a situation where somebody could not meet the requirements. Now, granted, I don't know how many design changes, I don't know the costs involved with people making them work. I mean, obviously, you do have changes even to some types of corporate architecture, the stack bond look. I am, one thing that we found out for sure. You're talking about a major corporate type of chain, restaurant. They have lots of standard plans and lots of variations. There are a lot of quarter plans in a lot of areas of the country. And I would say that, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being, the highest type of, the strictest you'd have would probably like about a 7, would be my guess.
Yeah.
6 to 7, about in there. And so we've found that it's certainly worked over the years for a lot of different projects, again, all non-residential, and we've been able to find, with people designs that work.
The signage requirements is where you hear the most complaints, isn't it?
Sure.
Just briefly, because no, these are all different buildings, and maybe you can just tell me quickly. I mean, I'm not, and if people are offended by the architectural standard here, that's fine. I'm not meaning to make it personal. I'm just trying to use my experience, having developed in different counties and different municipalities around the state to try to understand if some of these things would be outlawed. Does that make sense? Are we talking about something that makes sense here? Oh.
Okay.
Is there any color correction there?
Well, not that I'm aware of, but we won't. Color's not an issue here. It is kind of washed out with the fluorescent light. Nonetheless, I'm not sure on this now.
I don't think it would be foundation plantings.
Correct. In this particular view, you don't have foundation plantings on
just turn that particular
side.
Can you stand at the podium so you can flip through these things? Because I just want to go through them quickly.
Mr. Chairman, where is this Starbucks? Is this the one at the
This one is in Ocala.
Okay.
This is on a major thoroughfare in Ocala, Florida. So there's some foundation plantings and some awnings. I have some. It has wall pack lighting.
Yeah, you're allowed to have wall pack lighting.
You are allowed
in
to
the
have
corridor.
wall pack.
What you can't
Okay,
have.
that's fine.
Let me you have to shield it so that it's going into the building, up, down, or sideways, but not coming out.
Is this a commercial prototype building? I mean, this is...
I'm not seeing too much here, and John can comment too on this if he wants, I mean, other than the foundation plantings, you probably need more than what I'm seeing if all the sides, if this was the only green area between the parking area and the building.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you'd probably have to have more.
And I would not comply with the 5s. I know I wouldn't be with the 5s.
Yeah, I think you would have.
Okay, so let's look at another one. Let's look at another one. So there would be things about this that would not comply.
Right.
But probably not particularly expensive ones.
I think that's correct.
Okay. So this is another one, and this is a masonry building. Again, we've got a foundation planting problem. We've got a parking every 5 spaces problem.
Where is this one, please?
The location of this one is Gulf Breeze, Florida, which is on the barrier island of Escambia County, Pensacola. And that center section, I mean, these are the types of rules that start to concern me. That center section that's brown is masonry, and it is stacked bond masonry. It's very fancy.
Yeah, and I can't see the pattern there, but I believe you.
I mean,
you can certainly do
Carolina ceramics. It's very expensive.
Right, and you can certainly do a facade or the real brick, like apparently this is in the standard pattern, and that's probably what the adjustment would be for something like this. I think you would also probably tend to have for more foundation plantings. You'd probably have you see the one palm tree on the one corner. You'd probably have a little more of that on the corners.
What about the awnings? I think they're closer than 24 inches apart.
I don't think that.
What about the things along the top, the metal things?
What's the 10% on the color and the trim? I can't remember the detail. What about
I think the darker brown, the brick is exempt when it's a kind of a natural color. Right. I think as far as the color of that building, that's probably, again, it is hard to see the color, but it's probably a base color. And if it's just a darker color down at the bottom, that would probably be the darker brown. If that's not brick, then that would be a secondary color up to 30%. I mean, I'm not really seeing anything major along, and I'm assuming that these are parapet walls all the way to, you've got...
Yeah, they're parapet walls.
You've got everything screened on the rooftop here, it looks like.
So Sam, are you saying it will deter development?
Here's one thing. It says, corporate signature or commercial prototype architecture.
Where are you reading?
This is page 7.
Which attachment?
This is attachment. I don't know if you guys were they given this?
No, I think what you're, no.
I am referring to the actual corridor regulations, section 911.22, other corridors related to special regulations. This is, I don't think this was handed out in your packet. It was sent to me, but I'll just read it to you. I'll read it into the record. Prohibited architectural styles. The following are prohibited. Corporate signature or commercial prototype architecture, unless such is consistent with these special corridor requirements. Examples of such prohibited architecture include flat-roofed convenience stores, gas stations, and canopies for gas stations, car washes, and drive-through facilities. This is a commercial prototype architecture that has a drive-through facility.
But your corporate, with a few tweaks, it meets the standard. It's pretty close to the standard.
So that was
where it says such as consistent with the requirements. So if you meet the requirements,
so that would be okay.
That's the unless, and I think the type of corporate architecture that we're talking about that would be prohibited, and we'd kind of discuss the kitschy type of stuff that you could never convert that building. And you knew it was always a Jack in the Box because it's just this giant rectangle. You knew it was always a KOA office because it has a 1 to 400 pitch with the eaves down 2 feet above the ground.
So none of these buildings would run afoul of the commercial.
Right, I think the
prototype building.
All that I saw, what you showed me, would be some minor adjustments to the building, perhaps.
Right.
And more foundation plans.
The canopy and gas stations, if you go out, this is on the corridor plan for Highway 60, which is obviously a major thoroughfare, so it can't be compared to 49th.
Right.
But on the other hand, if you want to see what it looks like, is that is it Chevron on the 82nd and 60 was one of the first gas stations that came in. They came in with the flat edges, and all what they had to do was come up with a facade that slanted. It was not a major, and by my thinking, it was a fairly simple change.
Okay. They used a mansard in that.
To the plan.
So that would be appropriate countywide.
Right.
Okay. Okay. All right. All right. Okay, well, I
If you
think,
ever have a question, there's a Gene Waddell.
No, he's the
has given about
yeah.
has given about a third of his life to
Yeah,
this
he
now.
has.
And if we start changing it, I don't want to be here to listen to him.
no, I don't want to change it.
I love him, so I don't. You know, I can't say.
I want to make sure it's appropriate county-wide.
As to the quarters, as the quarters, I'm not sure. I think that maybe road to road, we have to look at 1, 2, and 3, because I mean, this started off with Oslo,
Right.
60,
Wabasso.
510, US 1. We tried to get it into US 1 major thoroughfares. Now, I hadn't, you know, I'm not sure I saw the leap into 49th and 53rd.
That's
and so
what my
forth.
question is.
Right.
Should
And
we
I-
consider whether these specific ones, which are great for Route 60, have served it well, are appropriate on all these other ones?
And I don't, once we got toned, from experience, once we got in tune with what needed to happen, there was very little problem meeting the standards.
I
And
see
I'm
that
not
now.
sely the cost became relatively speaking, high.
Right.
You know, you don't want to, we go down 49th now, to grandfather, to move that needle is going to be a little harder, but I don't know that we have a real problem with that.
You think these standards are appropriate countywide?
I do.
Okay. All right.
What I'd like to see as a county down the road.
Okay. All right. Well, that's my issue. I'm satisfied. I needed some education on that because I read it and I was alarmed that some of the things but what I've heard is that there really are minor, very minor things and not major cost things and tweaks.
Right, what you showed us would be the sort of thing we'd get at a pre-app, and there'd be some basically some minor adjustments from our standpoint, minor adjustments,
Low
and
cost.
they could make it work.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, if there's no one else has any real major issues with anything else, in light of the fact that it's getting later and whatnot, I'd move we accept all other recommendations as presented by staff with what already changes we've made.
Second.
The motion was made by Mr. Hamner and seconded by Mr. Tripson. Mr. Chairman, I would only interject that this is a public hearing, and we do have two members of the public here. I don't know if they have anything else to address the commission on as
Sorry.
far as the land use regulations, or else if you're going to do that, then close the public hearing.
Gentlemen?
If there is no more.
Please come up. I'm opening the public hearing.
For that sake, if it's, I'll remove the motion and we'll clear the air until they're done.
Name and address, please, for the
My
record.
name is Glenn Powell. I live at 12845 Bay Street in Roseland, and I'm here to talk about the proposed changes to the county code that would prohibit the use of single-family residences as vacation rental homes for periods of less than 30 days. I moved down to the area about 10 years ago from Atlanta, and over the years I've acquired 15 annual rentals, unfurnished annual rentals I rent out. 4 of the houses that I have are older stock housing and very appropriate more for vacation homes than it would be for annual living. No garage, no real closets, sort of picturesque, and in areas that are cute and charming if you're going on vacation, but when you have to deal with it every day, a little bit harder. We had looked at county code before we said, can we do a vacation rental? And at the time, it seemed like pretty clear. There were no regulations on it at all. And pretty much our vacation rentals during the winter, they're rented pretty much all winter, a month, 2 months, 4 months, 6 months, 2 snowbirds, just as you would imagine. We are very diligent about collecting the 11% lodging tax, like Ebenezer Scrooge, getting it from the tenants and reporting it and remitting it. The winter ends, and then we have the summer. And the people that we attract during the summer are not people who want to get away from the north and have a month or retire, but they're people who want to come to Indian River County and spend a vacation. The people we attract are people who come to Indian River County, don't go to Miami, don't go to Orlando, don't go to New Orleans for Mardi Gras. The people who come here to enjoy the natural beauty that we have to offer. These people are educated, active professionals who have a week or 2 weeks for vacation, like most of us. They don't have the month or 2 months or 3 months. It's sort of interesting, the group of people that we've attracted over the years, and we get a lot of repeat customers. And, you know, those people are very free with their discretionary income, support a lot of the local businesses, which I know a lot of the people in the area really appreciate. When we moved down here full-time about 6 or 7 years ago, and make this our home, and actually live in Roseland, and 3 of our vacation homes are in Roseland, and, you know, within sight, and the other one is in Wabasso, directly behind the Wabasso tackle shops that are wedged between US 1 and Bristol Bay. In 2006, we got a letter of violation from code enforcement. Not because there's anything wrong with what our tenants were doing. It was more of a personal issue between a neighbor and me that had nothing to do with any tenant in my house. And I thought it was sort of ironic because that particular neighbor advertises her home for weekly rentals with no mention of collecting lodging tax. You know, and I was sort of mystified, and, you know, I reread the code, and nothing had changed in, you know, the 3 or 4 years that we had turned that property into vacation home. And Stan was great in spending time. We met in person, and after a lengthy discussion and examination of the actual written code, we realized there is nothing in the code as it's written that really addresses vacation rentals. Stan had given me some history about how back in the 80s when the Disney Resort was being built, there was an issue with this and an issue with that. But since then, especially with the advent and the widespread use of the internet, which really has caused the big vacation home rental business, the county code really hasn't addressed it. He said, we will. It'll be down the road, and you know, and we'll come up with appropriate regulations for it. And I offered at that time, you know, to participate, you know, because I do it. And he said, well, I could tell from what you do and how you explain you do it that you do it very responsibly, and you're one of the good ones. and I appreciated that. And we continued to rent, you know, with his knowledge and the county's knowledge. 4 years later, in 2010, we get another violation notice. Again, nothing to do with tenants, because at that time, all of our houses were vacant. And, of course, complaints are made anonymously, but I could tell it's either this neighbor or that neighbor. And actually, at that time, both neighbors were offering their homes as vacation rentals, not collecting lodging tax. So I talked to Stan again, and he said, oh, no, we haven't changed the code, but we're just enforcing it this way. And we had a little bit of a discussion about enforcing, the difference between enforcing a written code and enforcing a code that everybody thinks exists, but really doesn't exist in black and white. And, you know, this is something that's been sort of close to me to watch over the years. And, of course, this is not an issue just affecting in Indian River County.
Where is, where is this in what we have?
Okay, yeah, this is it's mainly on attachment 1, page 2, the definition of hotel motel, adding in a definition of an existing use category, lodging facilities. So it's kind of toward the top of page 2. Hotel motel and lodging facilities.
I was trying to shuffle some paper.
Please carry on.
Sure. And so when I talked to Stan in 2010, you know, I had shared with him some of the information I'd gathered over the years of when the code is written the way the county code is written, when a county chooses to enforce it the way they were planning to enforce it, that the courts pretty much unanimously rule in favor of the personal property owner, you know, because you have to protect personal property rights very broadly if there's not this explicit, definite code that's actually written. So, and again, I offered one more time, you know, since I was one of the good guys, to, you know, meet with Stan, and when the county was ready to deal with, you know, the relatively recent phenomenon of vacation homes, you know, I've been doing it for years. I do it well. You get no complaints. And to participate in any kind of workshop or hearing, any kind of plan to actually deal with this. So 2 weeks ago, I'm on the county website looking for something completely different, and I happened to notice this notice that this meeting was going on, and land use, you know, development changes. So I read it, and I read this particular section about the redefinition of hotels and limiting use in single-family homes. And although I applaud the county's progression in actually addressing this and putting something in black and white code so it can be enforced. I was frankly a little shocked, perplexed, and to be honest, a little curious about why I wasn't included in having any kind of a role and figuring out how this could be a win-win situation for everybody. We bring in a lot of people to the county who would just go somewhere else if they couldn't get a vacation rental. We bring in a lot of dollars. We're one of the responsible vacation home owners. And, we certainly get that, code is there to sort of have that fine line balance between personal property rights while maintaining, the standards of the community, and everything has to be balanced very fairly. And, we live in the community. We get it. And, so I'm in complete agreement with those who want to protect what's really good about Indian River County. I had the good fortune to meet with some of the county staff yesterday, some that I just recently met and some that I've known for years, and I respect them greatly, and I know they only want to do the right thing for the county, and so I asked some pointing questions because this has been, at least in my knowledge, in their knowledge, for 6 years since I brought it up, and I asked, well, have you gone around and looked at the vacation rentals in the county? It's very clear. You go online and, in 10 minutes you could get like 100 of them. And they said, no. I said, have you ever stayed in a vacation rental? No. I said, I've been doing this for 10 years. I have 4 properties. How many times has any kind of law enforcement officer been called to my properties? They said, I don't know. I said, never. It's never happened. So I said, so what, is the issue? And they said, as I expected, well, with vacationers, you get all the loud parties, you get all the traffic, you get people on the street, you get noise in the pool, and and I get that because we get that everywhere. We get it with people who own their homes. We get it with people who are in annual rentals. I think everybody here has had a bad neighbor or knows of a bad neighbor who owns a home or rents a home, and there are already code restrictions on how to deal with that, and already laws on the books about how to deal with that. And then there was the thought, well, that just vacation rental landlords are just bad neighbors, and I'm sure there are a lot of bad vacation rental landlords, just like there are a lot of bad people who own their homes and don't keep them up and affect their neighbors, and there are a lot of people who rent a home for more than 30 days, who rent it for a year, and they're bad neighbors too. I mean, I have them. And I thought it was sort of ironic that I've had people in my homes who've been there for a week or 2 weeks, and they come to me complaining about their neighbors who own their houses or rent their houses, and they complain about the noise, they complain about the loud music, they complain about the trash, they complain about the illegal activity. And so I was trying to figure out, well, what is this issue? And I said, is this really just a vacation rental issue? So before the meeting, I walked down to community planning, and I see all the code enforcement violations and all these people being brought in. And I'm looking, these are all owner-occupied or rental issues. These are all like junk on the property, big weeds, properties not maintained. Well, if you have a vacation rental, it has to look great. That lawn has to be mowed. That house has to be painted. There can't be trash in the yard. It has to look great. And I would suspect that 99.9% of the code enforcement violations on that board on residential properties are properties that are owner-occupied and or occupied by somebody who lives there and renting it full-time. So, why am I here? And, it may surprise you to hear that I support some sort of regulation of short-term rentals. I think that there are a lot of people who do it in the shadows because there's this nebulous law out there. So they don't do it well. They attract the wrong people. They're happy to just get what they can. And they definitely don't collect lodging tax. I mean, you could actually read some of the ones who actually put it online. It's like, how could you put online? You don't charge tax. I do support some sort of regulation with it. I do understand that there are fears, and I do understand that there are concerns, but you don't write code based on fear. You don't make big decisions based on fear. It's making a decision on fear is like making a decision based on racial profiling or saying that women should be denied the right to vote. I mean, it just doesn't make sense. You have to deal with the fact. And so once again, I offer to community planning that I'd be most willing to sit down and talk to them and come up with my experience of how to do this well, how to write a code that everybody gets what they need. Neighbors can get good neighbors. Vacationers could come in and give the county people money. People who have properties that really aren't geared for like really good tenants for annual rentals can get somebody in to help pay the mortgage on the months that we don't get seasonal rentals. And pretty much when you have vacation renters in your home and in the county, they actually contribute a lot to the county without using a lot of our county resources. They don't use the schools, they don't go to the library as much. They don't have such a demand on us. I was sort of surprised when I went online to read how other communities handle this. Because I had asked county yesterday, so what kind of regulations have you looked at over the last years to figure out that this is how you wanted to word this? And there was some discussion about what they do in Key West, which isn't really appropriate for here, and the Key West law actually has a lot of loopholes in it, as I found out from an acquaintance of mine.
Can I interrupt you just 2 seconds here? Because procedurally, I was trying to figure out where to go and how to go. Is in order to do what he's talking about, are we talking about a change in the policy at the top and working it through the LDR system versus changing what we've got as an LDR?
I think that's
because
that's correct.
The LDR we've got starts in the EAR.
Well, no, actually, the EAR didn't get to this issue. This is staff initiated to put it in black and white and to clarify an interpretation that not only staff has had, but Code Enforcement Board as recently as 2010 with some activity in some
the dilemma
places.
is trying to figure out vacation renters from non-vacation renters in these weeklies. I mean, there's been a lot of issues that
Yes,
went
we're
through
talking
time.
about
So
all the residential zoning districts potentially affected. That's so it would be to. I think what Glenn is eventually going to ask you to do is to pull this issue out, to not clarify or put into black and white the existing interpretation, but to have the Board of County Commissioners direct staff to look at allowing short-term stays in residential zoning districts and coming up with regulations for that.
at a certain time of the year.
I don't,
Well, the thing is this. This is like prohibition. The law may have been in place, but everybody was drinking anyway. And whether we have this law or not, people are still, we're just going to push it into the shadows. I mean, the people are still going to be doing it. We don't have the staff or the enforcement mechanism to do it. So there's some sense in what he's saying. It's probably better to legalize it under certain conditions than to say, oh, it doesn't exist and it's illegal now, and then people aren't paying their taxes, and if there's a problem, again, we have to be reality-based here.
I understand that. The good news, bad news is, and you're not going to like this, but I'm in favor of moving on with this, and if we can get you changed later, that's fine with me. But I'm not willing to change that tonight.
But this doesn't have to go back to formula.
But
This doesn't have to go all the way back.
I think that within reason, I think that this has come up a lot. Within reason, if we can codify something that makes sense, then it is good for the county, and there are certain things that make sense. With vacationers, it's the definition of a vacationer is sometimes hard to get in certain parts of our county when weekly and daily rentals occur anyway. And that's when you see a lot of the code enforcement, I think.
Well, and I understand that, and you say that's when you see a lot of code enforcement, but that's not the case. That's the fear that I'm talking about.
Not the vacationers, you're right. There's a fear, but you're right in trying to get it black and white in the code.
Well, the thing is that right now, the code, you can't enforce it because it really doesn't exist.
Yeah.
I mean, it just doesn't exist.
That's why I'm not willing to let this go through.
Yeah, we disagree
without clarifying
on the interpretation of the existing code.
And we do agree on it.
We haven't disagreed since 2006.
And I do know that if, let's say, the county did decide to, push the point to me, and if it ever did go to the courts, we would win, and we would also be able to get punitive damages. And that's not what this is about. This is about how do we deal with the proposed amendment to the code, because it is a proposed amendment. It's not clarifying what's there, it's actually changing it, because it's actually going to be in black and white. And this is something that Stan himself told me, that we didn't even deal with it because it didn't really exist back then.
Perhaps reasonable people can disagree on that, but what I want to understand is if we were to remove this and leave it a gray area, since it obviously is, since you felt compelled to make it black and white, is this similar to the other things that we removed that has to go back to the comprehensive plan, or is this something we can just strike with the recommendation that there be workshops and that regulations be developed? I mean, we don't want to do the mine thing again, but there is a process for doing these types of things when there's a rational argument to be made, or reasonable people could get together and decide how this ought to be done. He said a lot of meaningful things, but the truest thing is it's happening anyway, and it's going to keep on happening. And do we want to bring it out into the light and put a little sunshine on it and make sure it's good for everybody, or do we just want to shove it into the shadows and just have the good ones and the bad ones, and we have nothing?
The only difference between your thoughts and mine are simply that I'm going to vote to move this ahead. We'll put the caveat to tell the board, county commissioners, they want to look at weekly rentals, and they need to tell us they want to do that, not the other way around.
But
because
moving it ahead is changing it.
The board of county commissioners, this is where it needs to be, and the issue should come from. That's just in my opinion. It's a weak, thin, red-headed opinion.
Well, I think there's another option between saying, well, let's just put it under the, like hide it and not deal with it, and actually, what you're saying is actually change the code without any kind of input from anybody who does this, without any kind of input from anybody who does it well. And, that just doesn't make good sense. And, I've sat here for 2.5 hours, and I've heard about eucalyptus trees, and I've heard about 25 feet minus 50 feet and this and that. And to think that you would change my livelihood and just put something in the code without any kind of discussion, without any kind of reasonable meeting of very reasonable people to figure out how to deal with this.
I'm not sure that, I understand what your concern is, I'm very sensitive to it, but I'm not sure we couldn't fashion a motion that would communicate clearly with the Board of County Commissioners that we're not in favor or against it. It's just that it needs to be reviewed before it's made a law. Right. It may very well be that we come out at the end of this, and I'm totally prepared to believe that, on balance, it's a bad idea. We're not going to do it. But it's perhaps an issue that really ought to be discussed.
Airing it, that's
fine. Mr. Chairman. Mr. Powell, how does the proposed change in the definition affect your business?
Well, right now, the way it's worded in the written code, which is what you have to go by in order to enforce it.
The definition of hotel motel.
Yeah.
Okay.
It doesn't apply to what we do.
Yeah, lodging.
If you actually read it, it doesn't apply to a single-family residence. And then when I met with Betty originally and had a brief conversation with Roland on the phone and then met with Stan, they said, well, the hotel definition says this, so you're a hotel. And it's like, no, I'm not a hotel, because it had to do with day limitations. And I said, well, if you have a hotel, but if you rent for more than 30 days, then you're not considered a hotel. And it's like, that has nothing to do with the single-family residence, and if you rent it for less time. The proposed change actually addresses, if you have a single-family residence, how long you could rent it for, what your minimum rental could be. And that's very detrimental to, me during the summer, and certainly for the county to collect lodging tax.
Because of the addition and lodging facilities? Is that what's kind of clears that air?
Well, the disagreement on the interpretation is this. You have a single-family home. Mm-hmm. When does it become commercial instead of residential?
Right. Yep.
And so it has to fit a category that's in the code. One category is single-family dwelling. Is it a single-family dwelling? What makes it? When does it go from single-family dwelling to a lodging facility?
Right.
We don't have a definition of lodging facility. We have a definition of hotel/motel, which some of the characteristics apply, but some don't. But we have no definition of lodging facility. And our interpretation has been, a lodging facility is where you pay for lodging. It doesn't have to be configured like a hotel, it doesn't have to have a parking lot or anything like that. It's a lodging facility if you rent for less than 30 days. And that's reflected in a couple of the other uses, like Disney's, resort, short-term stays and all. So that's the interpretation, and the Code Enforcement Board has, gone with that, like I said, in 2010 when there were some cases in Summer Place where we had some good evidence. So that's the issue. What we're proposing here is to put that into black and white. What is a lodging facility?
What you're saying is anything less than 30 days
is a lodging
on the continuum of residential to commercial.
Exactly.
Less than 30 days
Correct.
is too commercial for a single.
It's a
family.
commercial,
right.
it's a
It's different.
commercial
The
use in a residential
It's a
area.
commercial
That's
use,
right.
and it's
That's
30
correct.
days is where you've set the mark for.
And that's where the county has actually set the mark, and so what is proposed is to put into black and white that definition of lodging facility that we have been using. So, you need to make a recommendation to the Board of County Commissioners on whether to go forward with the existing interpretation or some of the other options that have been discussed. Just keep the interpretation the way it is, and if the board wants to direct us to look at that issue, and maybe it won't be as long as the mining issue, but I guarantee you when you open up every single family zoning district for short-term stays, there's going to be a lot of input at some point.
Well, I think that if something is going to be a hot topic, it's something that shouldn't be blindly passed today. It should be something that, first of all, should be examined, be talked about in workshops and in meetings, as I've offered for over 6 years. And, after my meeting yesterday, I spent a few hours online, and I came up with several codes from different municipalities about how they dealt with this. This is not an Indian River County only problem. This is not a Roseland only problem or Basso only problem. There are many ways to control this.
The 30-day portion has been from, as long as has been for a very long time.
Except the code doesn't say that. That's the issue. That's why they're proposing to actually put this in the code in black and white. And that's the point. I mean, there are many ways to deal with this. And, one would be to have a county registration for all properties that are vacation rentals, with some sort of annual fee like $100, $150. This is what other municipalities do. That the people have to get their application and to get the permit, they have to show that they have a state tax registration.
But it's worse than that because you're buying houses in the middle of residences that may not want you to rent.
I have news for you. The houses that I bought in those neighborhoods.
That's my dilemma. I believe you. I mean, I think that does go on. But I mean, the fact that you bought 10 houses in a residential area that everyone thought at the time was 30 days or longer, maybe rentals, and you now transfer it back to weekly, I'm not sure in the neighborhood, if a given neighborhood, what's to stop that from any neighborhood in the county?
Well, I think what would stop it, Mr. Hamner, are the deed restrictions. I know that in my subdivision that there are deed restrictions.
If they exist in older areas, they may not exist.
True, they may not.
And that's where the
code would
That's why
step
this
in.
becomes a bigger issue. You don't like kicking the can down the road, and I understand that.
No.
I may very well get outvoted. My thought is I push this ahead. If they want to look at it, then I have no objection to having it looked at. If there's not clarity in the law, I prefer to have clarity of some kind in hand.
Well, clarity of some kind is not necessarily better than no clarity. I mean, clarity of some kind could be very detrimental. And, this is just the point. There were workshops and hearings, and, I was stunned that I wasn't involved in any kind of conversations. And then I spent several hours yesterday coming up with what other municipalities do that are very easy.
What if we wanted to stay on this side of the fence, like George said, but we wanted to have a process that could begin immediately to consider alternatives? And it may turn out one way, it may turn out another. I mean, is there some rational way to do this? Because I think what George is saying makes sense too. We may just want to stay on this side of the fence, but an appeal almost happening immediately. Is there some way to do something like that? Is there something like that could be structured? I mean, obviously, this gentleman needs to speak in front of the Board of County Commissioners. He has an argument to be made, and I think his argument should be fleshed out a little bit better with you. I think there's more that you guys need to listen to from him and maybe other people he could do. I mean, I want to stay on this side of the fence, but I want the appeal to begin now.
Aren't we saying that we would be changing this because of that 30 days? Less than 30 days?
If you pass this, it will be a change because it will be in black and white. What exists right now doesn't exist in black and white and is there for interpretation, and courts would rule that the personal property owner has the right to rent for less than 30 days.
I mean a formal appeal. I mean an informal
Right.
appeal. Would you be okay with, something like that? Does that make sense?
I
to
don't
you?
mind that with the caveat that they begin to look at it, and we recommend that it does get looked at. But I think what happens then is everybody's opinion about how it goes is I'm thinking, okay, I'm good with this, but I'm only good in the summer versus good in the winter with it. You got to be monthly. And I mean, there's a lot of, and I don't mind airing it out at all. I think it's fine. My biggest concern is creating commercial in the middle of a residential that was never maybe intended to be that, just because a different person bought it and wants to pay for the house and has a clever way or an intuitive way to do that.
Well, and I agree with you, because I live in those communities. And, and my neighbor who tried to do vacation rentals, it would have been disastrous if she could figure out how to do it.
But I can't pick you over someone else. My concern is that
I don't think you should, and that's why I'm saying you should pull this out. And before you change the code, just having a change is not better.
We do not change the code. We make a recommendation to the Board of County
Well, make a
Commissioners.
recommendation to change the code.
I understand. Let me say this to you, and I'm only speaking for myself, but maybe others would agree. You have given a very eloquent and persuasive argument, because I can tell you most people would read that and that idea that it's 30 days and think that was very sensible and frankly never think twice about it, basically based on what George said. I think you have a great argument. You presented it very, very well. It's my personal opinion that we should move forward with the recommendation that it stay in there. It's also, I would encourage you very, very much to continue your fight. You have a good case to be made, and I suspect you will prevail, if not to some degree in the law here, certainly perhaps in court. I hope you don't have to go that far. I hope reasonable minds and an accommodation can be made. But I think what George is saying makes sense, and I think on balance we should keep this on here. And but I also would encourage that that staff, devise some way to begin without delay to create some kind of a forum where, if this policy needs to be changed, that the process can begin now.
And I hear that. I guess I'm just a little confused, because I sat through 2.5 hours of all this stuff, and I heard about how all this stuff was being pulled back, and of course I don't understand half of it. But I understand that by the time it gets to you guys at this meeting, that the planning department...
Well, let me explain it to you this way. I'm 51% in favor of the way it's written, and because you've been here, I'm 49% doubting that. So the 1% is going to keep it written this way for me, and I'm going to encourage you to carry on. That's how I'm trying to explain it to you.
There's no reason that you cannot, and I would probably think in terms of a motion that we recommend this go forward as it is written, but with an additional caveat that says that the Board of County Commissioners consider the appeal and take a look at the weekly rentals into the future, because it's something that is an issue that needs to be clarified in some form or fashion.
But one could argue it's better ambiguous than being changed as well.
That's fine. I've been shot down before, so as I say, everybody vote your heart. I don't have a motion to that anything I can, but that's how I feel. So
we can express our sentiment to the Board of County Commissioners in a motion.
You don't have to.
Certainly.
You can make a recommendation, yes.
To listen to Glenn's argument.
Yeah.
Well, you would formulated a motion.
Well, I mean, the idea is that we've got this as a separate item from what we talked about earlier, as all the other items, is that the item that refers to hotel, motel, the changes and the definition of the lodging facilities, I recommend that we move with the staff's recommendation to the County Board of County Commissioners as written, with the caveat that the county commissioners can seriously consider the potential, if they feel it's worthy, of weekly rentals, vacation rentals, if they can figure out the definition.
Yeah, the proper licensing, regulation.
I'll second that.
That's my motion.
Any further discussion on this?
Move trips in a second.
Are we ready for a vote? All in favor?
Yes.
Aye. Opposed?
Opposed to, I think we should probably take this off the language and have it addressed at a hearing or a future workshop. So that's where I would oppose it. Otherwise, I approve the rest of the changes.
So that's a no, okay. Carry on.
Back to the last issue, I'd make the motion, we accept everything else with staff's recommendation and as written, having not overlooked that, so.
And I continue my second on that.
Any discussion? All in favor? Aye. Aye. Any opposed? Any other items that we need to discuss, or can I adjourn us?
Future meetings?
Right. We probably will not have a meeting June 14th, maybe June 28th, we're not sure yet. Probably only one meeting this summer, either at the end of June or in July. And we'll know more as the week unfolds, and that's all I had, Mr. Chairman.
Anyone else? We are adjourned.